Okay, let's start. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paolo Camarasana. I've taught medieval history in Trieste. Now I'm retired, as it is fair. I've been so for the last 10 years. Good morning to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. Today is the 25th of April. For us Italians, it's a very important day. But I'm sure that also the non-Italian colleagues will know about it and will participate as well. And I am sure because yesterday Christoph Dartmann had beautiful words for this situation we are living and this freedom, which is important now more than ever. It is important to defend it in all countries all over the world. Now, having said so, let's dive into the agenda. The first speaker is Professor Andrist from the University of Munich. Yes, Munich. The title is slightly different. So I have the new title. Let me see if I can read it. Probably my pronunciation will not be okay.
Bibles.
The architecture of Greek Bibles during the first millennium, between tradition and innovation. Professor, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you very much for this introduction.
From the small square folios of the 4th century Peter epistles preserved in the Vatican Library to the magnificent illuminated pages of the 10th century Paris Psalter, there is no doubt that Greek biblical manuscripts underwent a long and complex journey over the course of the first millennium. In the following minutes, I propose to examine certain aspects of this evolution from the often overlooked perspective of the architecture of the book. That is, by looking at how these biblical codices were designed. First, we will survey the concept of architecture in biblical manuscripts and illustrate its significance using Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus as examples. Next, we will broaden our scope by examining the architectural characteristics of some of Bibles produced before the Arab invasion, with a particular focus on Tetraevangelia and manuscripts containing the opening sections of the Septuagint. Finally, we will turn to the 9th and early 10th centuries to explore aspects of the transformation of Bibles during the first Byzantine Renaissance. Along the way, we will raise the question of the extent to which the architectural features under study correspond to broader trends in book production in their respective period and how they balance between tradition and innovation. Before we begin, I would like to briefly clarify 2 points. To avoid any misunderstanding regarding the codicological notion of the book, I will not speak of biblical books, but rather of biblical works or items. Secondly, this study is limited to codices whose primarily content consists of works from the Old and New Testaments, which I call Bibles, thereby excluding lectionaries and alternating commentaries, which, from my perspective as a book historian, do not fall within the definition of Bibles. It also excludes Greek biblical scrolls from the Dead Sea. Most importantly, my aim is not to provide a comprehensive history of the material evolution of the Bibles. Rather, I seek to highlight certain characteristics of these books and trace of changes, which in turn open up new questions and avenues for further study. Rather than beginning with a theoretical presentation of the concepts involved, I propose to introduce them by examining the two great 4th century biblical pandects. Beyond their biblical and paratextual content, what we seek to observe are the various structural elements that their producers, whether intentionally or not, incorporated at both the textual and material levels. Above all, we will examine the connections that emerge between these structures. We will focus on modular divisions determining modular units and modular entities, unexpected blank spaces, particularly unusual empty columns, structuring paracontents, not just paratexts, including unusual decorative elements. Let us begin with Codex Vaticanus and first identify what we call modular discontinuities. That is, points in the manuscripts where one quire ends with one text and the next quire begins with a different one. In practice, we find only 3 modular discontinuities in Vaticanus. The most significant occurs after the 3 brief Old Testament story, Esther, Judith, Tobit, that's what we have on the slide, and just before the 12 prophets. In other words, at the junction of 2 traditional Old Testament ensembles. As you can see in the slide, the discontinuity is marked not only by a blank column, but also by quire signatures indicating a quire change. There is also a change of hand here, which is difficult to illustrate in the slides, but is important to note. This discontinuity clearly results from the division of labor between hand C, following a recent identification by Jesse Grants, and hand B. Another modular discontinuity appears between second and third reigns. However, these 2 books always circulate together, and 2, no additional discontinuities are observed at this juncture, it is likely that this particular instance is coincidental, unlike the first case, which was the result of a conscious decision. This modular discontinuity defines what Marilena Maniaci has called modular units in her study on Atlantic Bibles. Technically, a modular unit consists of a series of folios which start at the beginning of both a quire and a piece of content, and ends at the end of both a quire and a piece of content. I have personally made extensive use of this concept as it provides a powerful tool for analyzing manuscript structure. However, the modular unit primarily concerns subdivisions within a single production and, therefore, does not account for the transformations of the codex may have undergone, such as restorations, and it does not consider the textual autonomy of the grouped quires either. This is why it is also useful to recognize sequences of modular units that are self-contained and form what I call modular entities. I'll return to this concept in just a moment. Another important marker of the architecture of a codex is the presence of unusual transition between textual units. Unusual, of course, in relation to the scribe's typical practice within the same manuscript. For example, exceptional decorative elements or, as we will emphasize here, extraordinary blank columns, a feature already observed in our first example. In Vaticanus, there are 4 instances of unusual empty columns, including 2 within quires with no change of hand. This is the case, for example, at the beginning of the Psalms, or here at the junction between the Old and New Testament, specifically between the end of Daniel and the beginning of Matthew. In both cases, the scribes deliberately placed the opening of a new traditional textual ensemble on a fresh recto, evidently for aesthetic and conceptual reasons, as there was no technical constraint preventing them from beginning on the previous page. Our findings can be summarized in what I call the blueprint of the manuscript, a relatively simple table that schematically represents the codex and provides the following information: the numbering of modular units, the information about quires, about content, generally also the corresponding pages or folio, sometimes the scribal hands, and or layout or decoration details if relevant. It is then easy to see where concomitant discontinuities are located. For example, here we observe the major discontinuity that we saw on the slide before between Tobit and the 12 prophets, and its four concomitant discontinuity. This divides the codex into two sections that could in principle be bound and function independently. And I believe that this potential was in the mind of the producers. The first part, or first potential volume, is further subdivided by unusual blank columns before the Psalms. The second part comprised the end of the Old Testament and the entire New Testament. It too is subdivided by usual blank spaces, as well as modular discontinuity as the end of the Catholic epistles, whose significance remains uncertain. Thus, we observe a three-tiered architectural structure. The lower, the lower level corresponds to the normal transitions between the biblical items. The highest level corresponds, in this case, to the two large sections. The intermediate level is determined, in this case, by the empty columns that subdivide these two sections. To further explain the concept of a modular entity and its relevance to our study, let us briefly examine the blueprint of Codex Sinaiticus. The remaining portion of the Codex consists of 11 modular units, fairly evenly distributed between the Old and New Testaments. The Gospel section of the New Testament comprises three modular units. The first originally contained the Eusebian canon tables, now lost. The second includes the three synoptic Gospels together. It ends with the non-standard choir. And the third contains the Gospel of John. By this period, it was well established that the Gospels were four in number and were copied together at the beginning of the New Testament. Moreover, for the canon tables to function properly, they need to be positioned near, in practice before, the Gospels. This is why we consider these three modular units as a single modular entity, because together they could constitute a meaningful circulation unit. The Prax Apostolus section shows no modular discontinuities, but the boundaries between traditional textual units are marked by unusual empty columns. Notably, both Revelation and the epistles of Barnabas are included in this entity despite their contested canonical status at that time. In other words, the architecture of this Bible reveals that, for the producers of Sinaiticus, Revelation and Barnabas were regarded as an integral part of their New Testament and were incorporated into the ensemble we refer to as the Catholic epistles. By contrast, the remaining portion of the Shepherd of Hermas are found in a third independent modular entity. Here also we are dealing with a three-tiered architectural structure. Now, if someone is interested to this question, I refer to my recent article. And we can now define a modular entity as all or part of a circulation unit, which starts at the beginning of both the choir and a piece of content, and ends at the end of both the choir and a piece of content. It is also autonomous in terms of its content and book tradition. Let us now leave the word of Pandects and examine the extent to which these architectural principles can also be found in other types of biblical manuscripts. When it comes to the earliest generation of biblical codices, we do not find clear cases of modular construction or multi-level architecture. This can be explained by several factors. On the one hand, the scarcity and poor preservation of multi-text manuscripts that have survived from that period, and on the second hand, the fact that many of these manuscripts were single choir codices, which I will not discuss here. Nevertheless, two manuscripts deserve to be mentioned individually. First, let us examine Hamburg Papyrus Bill 1, dated to the late 3rd or early 4th century. As its name suggests, this manuscript is bilingual. It contains in order the Acts of Paul, the Songs of Song and Lamentation in Coptic, Ecclesiastes first in Greek, then in Coptic. From a structural perspective, it is important to note that what remained of this codex belonged not to 4, but to 5 choirs, contrary to what is often stated. In fact, the second preserved quaternio is followed by a single sheet choir, a bifolio if you want, the end of which coincides precisely with the end of Lamentation in Coptic. I brought the pictures, but of course we don't see anything because of the state of preservation. Okay. This creates a genuine modular discontinuity between the two pages that were on the slides. However, the interpretation of this unit remains uncertain. Two key factors must be considered. Firstly, according to Bernd Diebner, the same scribe, hand A, appears in both units. If this is correct, it would strongly suggest that both units belong to the same editorial project. The discontinuity might then be original and result from the work being distributed among multiple scribes. However, this argument collapses if, as Rodolphe Casser believes, different scribes were involved in each unit. A second factor is the two ancient numbers found in the second modular unit, I have no slide for that, for which most probably are pages or folio numbers, and suggest that this second unit once circulated independently. In any case, the current codex presents a two-level structure, including two modular units. The second problematic manuscript is a fragmentary codex of the Gospel and Acts known to biblical scholars as P45. It is mainly preserved in Dublin and dated to the first half of the 3rd century by Pasquale Orsini. If we accept Theodore Skeet's reconstruction, this codex would exhibit modular discontinuities before the Gospel of Luke, Mark, and the Acts of the Apostles, as we see on the screen. However, a brief analysis convinced me that Skeet's reconstruction is fragile. As a result, it is more prudent to refrain from drawing conclusions at this stage. A highly modular construction is found in the well-known Tetravangelium Washingtoniense, which is potentially contemporary with the Codex Alexandrinus. In this codex, each gospel is placed within its own modular unit. When examining the composition of the choirs, it becomes apparent that the final choir of each unit has been systematically designed so that the gospel text ends precisely with the last page of the choirs, with minimal material loss, apart from two blank pages at the end of John. This clearly shows that this modularity was intentional and consciously implemented by the manuscript's producers. This type of systematic modularity can be observed in a whole series of Bibles, particularly among Tetraevangelia. However, this manuscript does not contain any specific paratext. It presents a flat single-level structure where modularity simply acts as a conventional marker between biblical items. We encounter the same modular principles in the famous Codex Rossanensis, copied on purple parchment, dated to the 6th century, and rightfully a favorite object of study among researchers, a star, if you want. As can be seen, this codex begins with a series of paratextual elements, including the famous Didascalia, which are excerpts from the Gospels, illustrated with fine paintings and accompanied by citations from the Old Testament. It also contains the not less famous painting of the Harmony of the Gospels. These decorative elements are concentrated at the beginning of the codex, offering a luxurious entry to the manuscript and the biblical text. However, as we shall see, this decorative pattern is a common design feature in luxury manuscripts and is not exclusive to biblical codices. It is also worth noting that this decorative approach is entirely different from what we find in some other biblical and not biblical manuscripts, such as the Ambrosian Iliad or the Cotton Genesis, which will also be discussed in this conference. Moreover, although the original composition of the initial choirs cannot be safely reconstructed, this initial section must have been constructed into several modular units, as it is strongly suggested, for example, by the presence of these two contiguous blank pages, which are structurally independent from one another. Further along, we find the Pinax Capitulorum, or chapter index of Matthew, followed by the end of a choir, and then the beginning of Matthew's Gospel on the first recto of a new quinio. This is therefore a clear modular discontinuity between the Pinax and the Gospel, but they are interlinked with one another because the first unit with the chapter index cannot circulate on its own as far as its content is concerned. The same configuration can be observed at the beginning of Mark's Gospel. In the Codex blueprint, we can clearly see how the resulting modular units are intrinsically interlinked to one another. By projecting this structural principle onto the lost portion of the manuscript, we deduce that the Rosanensis had a very flat single-level structure, yet remained highly modular. As a result, the interlinked modular unit 2, 3, and 4, which contain the technical paratexts and the Gospels, are textually autonomous and make up a distinct modular entity. It must be stressed that this phenomenon of interlinking or bridging between modular units is neither new nor unique to this manuscript. It can also be observed, for example, in Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Ephraimim Rescriptus, and other Tetraevangelia. For those in charge of these book projects, it was important that each gospel should begin on the first recto of a choir, which meant that the initial paratexts had to be copied at the end of the preceding choirs, making this choir indivisible. Let us make two additional observations about the size of the folios and the script. Firstly, we notice that the probable modular units containing the didascalia is smaller than the ones containing the gospel, as Marilena Maniaci and Pasquale Orsini indicate in their study of this codex. Secondly, they are not written in the same main script. The first modular unit is written in what Orsini analyzes as the manifestation B of pointed majuscule in this codex, while the large modular entity is written in biblical majuscule and the manifestation A of pointed majuscule. At this point, we cannot help but wonder whether the first unit containing the didascalia might actually be the result of a different production than the rest of the codex. One possible scenario would be, for example, that initially a tetraevangelium with capitula and Eusebian material circulated independently, and only at a later stage was the didascalia added to it. But before getting carried away, we must acknowledge that Orsini finds traces of upright majuscule A in the first modular unit, while upright majuscule B appears in the second, third, and fourth unit. He then naturally reached the same conclusion as Guglielmo Cavallo in 1987, that the same scribe copied all these folios. However, let us recall that two different codices circulating independently may have been produced by the same person. This possibility is all the less improbable given that Cavallo also suggested that several of the surviving purple codices of that time may have been produced in the same workshop located in the Syrian region. On a purely speculative basis, I stress, we could ask whether the current Rosanensis might not contain the remains of two manuscripts produced in this workshop. I hope that this question will encourage a re-examination of the issue with new studies and especially new data. We are lacking data about the size, the precise size and the layout and so on. We have general information, but the information of every folio will be needed for that kind of study. Before leaving the Rosanensis, let me add a remark. As I just mentioned, we have the remains of several biblical manuscripts from the 6th century or shortly after, copied on purple parchment. And yesterday we saw, I think, Codex Brixaniensis, that was also on purple parchment. A colloquium held in December 2020 highlighted the fact that all surviving Greek manuscripts on purple parchment from late antiquity are biblical manuscripts. This material characteristic may indicate that during this period, the use of purple parchment was a material feature reserved for Bibles. Let us now move away from the New Testament and examine some manuscripts containing the beginning of the Septuagint. The first codex is the Codex Ambrosianus, whose dimension, layout, and biblical majuscule script are reminiscent of Codex Vaticanus. Also, it appears to be about half a century younger. This codex presents a fairly simple two-level structure. On the one end, there is a straightforward sequence of items, which, with each new work beginning on the next column, as seen here in the transition between Exodus and Leviticus. However, there is a modular discontinuity at the end of the Pentateuch, which appears to conclude with a non-canonical choir without any apparent change of hand at this point. This suggests an intentional decision to conclude the Pentateuch on a specific modular unit, which is also, in principle, a modular entity, as it is also visible on the blueprint of the manuscript. With the Codex Colberto Seravianus, a contemporary of the previous manuscript, we once again find a two-level structure, this time with 5 modular units. If we accept that the 5 works which make up the Pentateuch could circulate either together or individually, we quickly realize that the Codex is divided into 2 modular entities. The first, corresponding to the Pentateuch again, is subdivided by only 2 modular discontinuities. Within its first entity, only the beginning of Leviticus does not coincide with a new modular unit, but the scribe took care to start it at the beginning of a recto, as we can see here on the slide. The second entity is more damaged, making it impossible to determine the original extent of the codex, but it is subdivided at least by 1 modular discontinuity. In this second entity, the book of Jude does not begin at the start of a modular unit either, but since this part is lost, we do not know how the transition was really handled in the manuscript. Most notably, all modular discontinuities coincide with changes of hand. The rationale between the distribution remained, however, unclear. Overall, this manuscript was built with a 2-level structure. To conclude this section, I would like to present the blueprint of the famous Vienna Dioscorides, copied around 512. In this manuscript, we can identify patterns reminiscent of those found in biblical manuscripts from the same period. Specifically, the first modular unit contains sumptuous illustration introducing the codex and immediately establishing it as a luxury manuscript. This recalls the structure of Codex Rosanensis and could be an element for the discussion of yesterday about the initial choir of the Amiatinus. It is followed by a pinax of the plants described in the manuscript, which, likely for practical reason, is placed in a separate modular unit. This is reminiscent of the Eusebian canon tables or the chapter index of the first gospel when it appears in the modular unit preceding Matthew. The main content is then presented in its own modular unit, and it constitutes a modular entity with the preceding modular unit. This corresponds to the structure of the Rosanensis. The additional sections are distributed across 2 further modular units, though this division into 2 might have been incidental. Once again, we encounter a 2-level structure in which modular divisions serves as marker of the second level. The scarcity of well-preserved non-biblical manuscripts of that time that allow for this kind of analysis requires us to be cautious and avoid drawing broad conclusions from an exceptional manuscript like the Vienna Dioscorides. However, this example is also enough to serve as a reminder that biblical manuscript production cannot be and should not be studied and correctly understood without considering the broader context of manuscript book production of the same period. We can now move to the period that historians have described as the First Byzantine Renaissance in the 9th and 10th centuries, in which the issue of tradition and innovation in the architecture of biblical manuscripts can be addressed even more clearly. Let us first revisit the type of biblical manuscripts in terms of their biblical content that we have already encountered. First, we observe that efforts to produce complete Bibles did not entirely disappear, but neither did they seem to intensify. As for this period, we have preserved fragmentary remains of only 3 Bibles. I'll let you, for question, I refer to my article. Let's compare here the first and the last of this pandect. Codex Basilianus, which can be dated to the second half of the 9th century, was designed very much in the spirit of what we found, for example, in the Sinaiticus. With a 3-level structure, in which modular entities corresponding to traditional ensembles are sometimes subdivided into subsections. By contrast, the Leo Bible, dated around 910 by Irmgard Hutter, has a flatter two-level structure and presents fewer modular units. For example, while the Basilianus distributes the Octateuch, the former historical books, and the later historical books, such as the Maccabees, into three separate modular units, the Leo Bible groups them all into a single unit without any particular subdivision. However, this should be qualified because the Leo Bible does demonstrate an awareness of the Pentateuch and the Octateuch, not in its physical structure, but in its initial table of content. As we see here, the five first books, referred to collectively as the books of Moses, conclude with the note total 5, marking them as a distinct group. Similarly, the end of the Octateuch is explicitly indicated. Moreover, the Leo Bible begins with a series of lavish miniatures, establishing it as a luxury book, along with some most practical paratext, even though art historians are not always convinced by their overall quality. This follows the same pattern as we've seen with Rossano Tetraevangelium and the Dioscorides. Overall, we can say that the Leo Bible, while aiming for a higher aesthetical level, is structurally simpler, yet also more systematic in his handling of transitions between biblical items. We now turn to Tetraevangelia very briefly. Among the dozen codices that can possibly be dated to the 9th century, and I say really possibly, we observe different configurations. Some Tetraevangelia have no modular structure at all. Other exhibit modular discontinuities at the beginning of each gospel. Finally, as we have already seen in earlier periods, some configurations show only one or two gospels preceded by a modular discontinuity without necessarily corresponding to a change of hand. Let us rather focus on new biblical configurations that appear from the 9th century onward, while keeping in mind that some of these might have already existed in earlier centuries, but we cannot evidence that. From the 9th century, we begin to see complete New Testaments, which I like to call New Testament pandects, and also independent Prax Apostolus manuscripts containing the Acts of the Apostle and the epistles, as Professor Warter yesterday showed to us. We also witness the spread of Bibles with frame commentaries, the early surviving examples of which apparently date to the late 8th century. However, it is important to remember that this phenomenon was not exclusive to biblical manuscripts, but extended to the broader high literature of the Greek and Latin words of the time. I will not discuss them here, but we will see an example later. Overall, we observe that paratextual material becomes progressively more dense and systematic, while the organization of the books remains very diverse and can be illustrated now through some example. Let us first examine Codex Kozinica III, which dates to the second half of the 9th century. This manuscript is one of the earliest witness to several developments in book history of the Bible. First, it is apparently the earliest preserved example of a complete New Testament. As confirmed by the scribal colophon, it is not one of the volumes of a complete Bible, but a book composed exclusively of the New Testament. This Bible is structured into two modular entities, following a predictable pattern. First, the Tetraevangelium, which is divided into two modular units. The first one contained the now lost Eusebian canon tables. It's a reconstruction. And in the second one, each gospel is preceded by a chapter list. This unit ends with a blank page. These two initial units make up a modular entity. Next come the Prax Apostolus, which also forms a compact entity. Most items follow one another directly with no efforts to begin on a new page, except at the beginning of the Catholic Epistle and the Pauline Corpus. and some other epistles, though not all, as though there were a hierarchy among the epistles. The Apocalypse, which is not located at the end but between the Catholic and the Pauline epistles, appears to belong to the less important items. Acts and the epistles are accompanied by the capital titles in the margin of the biblical text, but they are not gathered in initial pinnacs, surprisingly. Secondly, the Prax Apostolus itself is divided into two parts, through not by modular discontinuities or empty columns, but rather by some 11 pages of paratext preceding the Pauline corpus. A third innovation is also noteworthy. The scribe adds scholia on some pages, but very unevenly. It is likely for this purpose that he provided particular wide outer margin. Overall, the different parts of this New Testament are clearly distinguished from one another by the way they are separated and by the nature of their paratextual material. The manuscript presents again a three-level structure. Another configuration which is first observed in the 9th century and which will go on achieve great success, and again we had yesterday the explanation of Klaus Wachtel, is the Prax Apostolus as an independent book. In fact, only two extant examples can be dated to the 9th century, and they are structurally very similar. They present the biblical text in the same order, Acts, Catholic Epistles, Pauline Corpus. Unlike the New Testament of Kozinica, neither of them contains the Apocalypse. They exhibit a very flat single-level material organization without modular divisions or significant spacings. Unlike the New Testament we've just examined, where only the Pauline epistles were preceded by introduction paratext, here each epistle is preceded by what we call in our project anteparatext. I want to broaden our research perspective by considering first Codex Barocci III, a Prax Apostolus datable to the second quarter of the 10th century. This Prax Apostolus begins with Acts, followed by the Catholic Epistle, the Pauline Corpus, and the Apocalypse, which is no longer linked to the Catholic epistles, as we saw before. Each item is preceded by argumenta and capitula, and all are framed by commentaries. This manuscript has attracted scholarly attention because the frame commentary on the Apocalypse is attributed to the renowned prelate, humanist and prelate, I should say, Aretas of Caesarea. Some have even suggested that this manuscript was produced following his instructions, though this seems impossible to me, but it's another question. Let us highlight a few key points. First, and precisely, unlike the two 9th century Prax Apostolus mentioned earlier, the Apocalypse is included in the manuscript. This is even one of the earliest Prax Apostolus containing the Apocalypse. However, as also indicated in the blueprint, the Apocalypse is found in a distinct modular unit following a non-standard choir that concludes with Hebrews. And this is the only modular discontinuity in the manuscript. This did not happen by chance. The Apocalypse, along with all its paratexts, was produced in a completely detachable manner, either because it was so planned or because its inclusion in the Prax Apostolus was a later decision. In any case, this manuscript corroborates what is already known from other studies. Even in the 10th century, there were still uncertainties or reservations regarding the inclusion of the Apocalypse in biblical manuscripts. As I did in the first part of this presentation, I would like to conclude this brief overview of the First Byzantine Renaissance with a few remarks on non-biblical multi-text manuscripts. On the one hand, my preliminary surveys have shown that many manuscripts compiling the works of a single author, such as Gregory of Nazianzus or Plato, tend to be architecturally very simple, with a single-level material structure and only slight variations in the transition between works. However, there are some exceptions, notably a number of manuscripts belonging to the philosophical collection, as Filippo Ronconi pointed out several years ago. So for those that are not familiar with it, the philosophical collection is a series of manuscripts produced in the second half of the ninth century and mainly with biblical, non-religious material, mainly, but not only. Okay. As an example, we may consider Codex Palatinus Graecus 398. Here, the thematic units of these manuscripts has been debated, but it consists of 6 modular units, each forming a distinct modular entity containing multiple items. So the manuscripts show a two-level structure. This example illustrates that in the ninth century as well, the architectural phenomena we have discussed today were not exclusive to biblical manuscripts and should be studied in a broader context again. Inversely, the study of the architecture of non-biblical manuscripts would also benefit from being pursued in light of the observations made in biblical manuscripts. As we have seen, the way biblical manuscripts are constructed results largely from deliberate decision regarding their biblical perimeter, their paratextual components, and the material organization of these elements within a book. Overall, their architecture is not a matter of chance, even though certain aspects in specific manuscript may be. In most of the cases, the producers were aware of how they grouped various contents and of the intended outcome. This overview can only offer a brief glimpse, but I hope it has demonstrated the value of codicological and syntactical approach and highlighted some promising avenue for further research. We hopefully also see that a better understanding on how these books were designed and how their architectural principles evolved can only progress if we move beyond the divides that too often separate manuscripts of the Old and New Testament on the one hand, or biblical from non-biblical manuscript on the other hand. To conclude with yet another point of openness, the third divide that should be bridged is the one that too frequently separates Greek manuscript from other manuscripts produced in Christian regions, particularly around the Mediterranean. And I could not resist showing you the structure of the Codex Amiatinus, a manuscript built with a strong sense of modularity, closely but not exclusively tied to the distribution of work between scribes. This is then an invitation to continue this dialogue, much in the spirit of the beautiful conference we are attending here in Spoleto. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your remarks and questions.
Perfect timing. So, thank you so much for your beautiful lecture, on which I'm not going to say anything because I do not know anything about this matter. I could just say a few general things, and I believe will be of interest of scholars like me. So the great matters about late antiquity, which has been the main object of the interest of historians. So recently, another companion of late antiquity has been released, and so once again, you have described the paleographic aspect. So I believe that with these and with other previous lectures and um, the next lectures, um, we will say things that will be very interesting for um, study scholars of paleography. So, if I've well understood the concept on which you focused, so the modularity, the modular discontinuity, which, if I have well understood, you believe is never is always intentional. So I have understood well. I have understood correctly. But of course, we can now talk later. So now I can just thank you once again for this beautiful lecture, and I'd like to give the floor to Professor Christina Kreinecker from the University of Luan.
Professoressa, prego.
Grazie,
Tutto a
grazie
posto,
Dante.
grazie.
Thank you for the invitation to present here. It's an honor to come to Italy to this very honorable occasion. It's my first time in Spoleto, and it's beautiful both in sunshine and in rain. I would also like to thank the interpreters who we cannot see but make it possible that we understand each other in several languages. So thank you very much behind the scenes. The transmission and the history of the New Testament has always been multilingual. This starts with the almost banal observation that at the heart of Christian beliefs stands Jesus of Nazareth, an Aramaic-speaking Jew. Thus, even before the first New Testament writings came into physical being, there was an oral tradition in Aramaic in the immediate context of the historical Jesus and his disciples. There was also an oral tradition in Greek, for example, in the context of Paul the Apostle, and this marks only the beginning. While all of the 27 canonical writings of the New Testament were initially written in Koine Greek from the mid-1st to the early 2nd century, they were translated into other languages from the 2nd century CE onwards, starting with Latin, Syriac, and Coptic. This process of translating and transmitting the New Testament in multiple languages is still ongoing today. We are translating the Bible into Italian, English, German, and other languages. In other words, the New Testament tradition has been multilingual from its beginning. Analyzing its textual transmission is complex and full of challenges. Today, I want to address some of these challenges arising from the bilingual tradition. I will mainly focus on manuscripts from the medieval times, with occasional comparisons to earlier and later ones. But before we start, I have a preliminary thought. When referring to a manuscript of the New Testament, the term bilingual can refer to a variety of appearances. While generally indicating the presence of two languages in the same document, the designation bilingual does not specify where in a manuscript two languages appear. A bilingual manuscript can be a manuscript with the same text or with different text in two languages. It may be a manuscript in which the two languages were already present at the moment of production of a manuscript, or a manuscript to which text in a second language was added at a later stage. An example for the latter is Trismegistus 1151-94, an 8th century manuscript with a gospel text in Syriac and occasional marginal notes in Greek, which were added later. The late 9th century lectionary manuscript, Gregory Ireland L. 1349, however, preserves the Gospels according to Matthew and Luke in Latin, and the Latin part is also known as Vetus Latina 335, but it also contains psalms and the liturgical texts in Greek and Latin, and some of it in both languages. So this manuscript contains text in two languages, one following after the other, and in other parts the same text. While such manuscripts undoubtedly contain more than one language, in my paper today, a bilingual manuscript is understood as a manuscript in which the same text of the New Testament is present in exactly two languages. And here are the 7 points about which I'm going to talk today. And let me also take this moment to acknowledge my funding bodies, the Research Foundation Flanders, the FWO, and the European Research Council, the ERC, for the generous support of my research. My first point, traditional challenges. Studying the transmission of the text of the New Testament and its manuscripts is complex and full of challenges. This is true regardless of how many languages are involved. There are several fundamental challenges which apply to all language traditions of the New Testament. Among these are contamination, corrections, coincidence, and incompleteness. These big four are well known and remain unsolved issues, and some of this we have already heard about yesterday by Klaus Wachtel. So contamination. One of the greatest challenges is the contamination of the New Testament textual tradition through the multiple influences affecting each instance of copying. Contamination indicates that any New Testament text may derive from an unknown number of sources from different times and geographical contexts. This means that the transmission of the biblical text took place neither in a linear nor in a chronological way. This makes constructing a stemma codicum of New Testament manuscript relations, as we heard yesterday, based on the traditional philological principle of agreement in error, impossible. Recognizing, isolating, and identifying the multiple influences in any given manuscript is a huge challenge that cannot be managed like sorting out blue buttons from red buttons, although sometimes we wished it would. Addressing the issue requires a multitude of information and profound knowledge of the tradition. It also requires the ability to weigh insights from several centuries, different geographical regions, and a variety of historical backgrounds. Corrections. Corrections of text in manuscripts may have occurred at any time during the copying process or as part of post-production and reuse of a manuscript. Even a manuscript that does not show physical signs of correction may still contain corrections from its textual sources. The potential presence of a correction is something a textual scholar has to keep in mind, while at the same time not being incapacitated by an endless chain of could-have-beens. Even if corrections are present, they still require further interpretation and weighing. For example, in the famous interlinear Greek-Latin Codex Sangalensis from the mid-9th century, there is a correction in John 7:40 from accusantes ton logon, having heard the words, genitive plural, to accusantes ton logon, having heard the word in the accusative singular. While the genitive case with the verb akouo is standard in classical Greek grammar, the accusative can be used to indicate the content of what is heard. Also, the accusative case, instead of the genitive, is frequently used in Koine Greek and other books of the New Testament. However, in the context of the Gospel of John, where the logos in the singular plays an essential role from John 1:1 onwards, where the logos became flesh, one may start to wonder whether the change was also inspired for theological reasons to indicate a connection between Jesus Christ and the logos. There may also have been a change in textual preference over time, because the singular accusative seems particularly prominent in minuscule manuscripts, while papyri and earlier majuscules in general seem to favor the genitive plural. Of course, a correction can also be simply that, a correction, but not all correction fix a genuine mistake, as John 7:40 illustrates, so corrections need to be discussed individually and in context of the broader tradition. Coincidence. The picture is further complicated by the fact that similar readings occur at any time and place in the transmission due to coincidence and without the influence from a corresponding manuscript. Texts are copied by human beings who can make the same changes and introduce the same mistakes independently of each other. Technical developments have contributed to identifying cases of potential coincidence and also to analyzing potential patterns in individual manuscripts and scribes. However, an overall picture cannot be reached at this point, and cases have to be studied again one by one. Incompleteness. An additional challenge is the fact that the extant New Testament manuscripts are only a fraction of all manuscripts that were ever produced and copied. Only rarely are direct copies, Abschriften, with their exemplars, Vorlagen, preserved. Modern digital developments, such as phylogenetics, have proven excellent tools to identify more such Abschriften and families of manuscripts. When it comes to bilingual manuscripts, several such Abschriften are known. For example, in their Greek part, Codex Sangamanensis, and the fragmentary part of Codex Valdecensis are Abschriften of the 5th century bilingual Codex Claromontanus containing Pauline epistles. Also, the Latin parts are considered Abschriften, with Vetus Latina 75 a witness to Latin text type D, and Vetus Latina 76 deriving directly from it. But Vetus Latina 83 may be a direct copy of either Vetus Latina 75 or 76. Also, the Greek part of the 9th century Codex Augiensis is suspected to be either a direct copy of Codex Boernerianus or to come from the same source. The Latin text of Codex Augiensis, however, is closer to the Vulgate, and Vetus Latina 77, on the other hand, is usually considered a representative of Latin text type D and doublets representing text type I, and these are the Latin text types, not the Greek ones. Even with several upschriften identified, the main fact remains unchanged. The New Testament evidence is incomplete. Most of the time, it is impossible to even estimate how many more manuscripts must have existed to account for the changes and alterations which are contained in those manuscripts extant today. With the New Testament representing the largest extant manuscript tradition, this challenge is unique in scope. Over 5,600 manuscripts of the Greek New Testament are preserved, including fragmentary pieces with only portions of individual verses. The first complete texts are attested from the 3rd century CE. Contamination, corrections, coincidence, and incompleteness are, in a nutshell, the main challenges when working with the New Testament manuscript tradition. As mentioned earlier, they present themselves in any language tradition of the New Testament, but with a multilingual perspective, the complexity of these big four multiplies. And let's look at some of those. When studying bilingual New Testament manuscripts, one naturally enters the realm of translations. Originally composed in Greek, translations of the New Testament, so-called versions, date back as early as the 2nd century. No complete witness, however, has survived from that early period, and the picture is not much different for Greek New Testament manuscripts themselves. Only fragments have survived from the 2nd century, and the evidence for the text in the 3rd century is still scarce. As with translations, the strong attestation of manuscript evidence commences in the 4th century and peaks in medieval times. Reasons for this have been studied amply and include historical, theological, and practical observations. Each versional tradition has its own set of specific challenges, to some part also connected to the individual history of their scholarship. For example, while the New Testament in Greek is preserved in thousands of manuscripts, the majority of the readings represent a later stage of the text and come from the Byzantine period, as we have also heard yesterday. And in the Latin tradition, which we also heard yesterday, one of the challenges is the development from Old Latin versions to the later Vulgate ones. Although this was initiated by Jerome in the 4th and 5th century, the ecclesiastical approval for the new text, the so-called Vulgate, was not given until Pope Gregory in the late 6th century, and Old Latin readings would stay prominent until the 9th century. Since hardly any biblical manuscripts from the early period have survived, extracting an Old Latin text remains a methodological challenge. This is further complicated by the fact that most of the early attestation is preserved in the indirect tradition, that is, citations of biblical text in early Christian writings, which have their own manuscript tradition with the same problems of variant readings and corrections and so on. And in addition, the majority of manuscripts survives from later medieval times, so problems multiply. Analyzing the Coptic tradition of the New Testament is a multilingual endeavor in its own right due to the existence of multiple forms of Coptic dialects, with Sahidic usually being considered the oldest. The Bohairic dialect is of particular interest in Arabic Coptic bilingual manuscripts from the 12th century onwards, produced in Egypt. In general, there is a material challenge in studying the Coptic tradition, since dividing codices and even cutting individual pages to receive more money for them is part of the excavation and preservation history of Coptic biblical manuscripts. Therefore, identifying, combining, and digitally, as you can see here, uniting fragments and folios are tasks required before studying the text itself. The situation for other early translations is not much different. The study of the Syriac New Testament also faces challenges of different versions, like the Peshitta and the Haklensis. And only a few portions of the text of the New Testament survive in Gothic, including the 6th century Latin Gothic bilinguals Codex Carolinus and the Fragmentum Gisense, both produced in Italy, but I won't say anything more on Gothic because the experts are in the room. and I'm not one of them. The scholarly study of the Arabic New Testament, by comparison, is still rather young, and many questions remain open. In other words, scholarship on the various language traditions has progressed at different speeds and with different intensity, with Greek and Latin being the most prominent. Yet even with centuries of textual scholarships on the Greek and Latin New Testament, the discipline is far from having solved the main issues. Also, we are far away from compiling a complete picture of the overall transmission of the New Testament. Let us have a closer look at the linguistic challenges of a multilingual tradition. Linguistic interactions are difficult to map when it comes to establishing similar and variant readings between texts of different languages. A particular challenge in analyzing New Testament translations and their linguistic exemplars arises when the two languages belong to different language families. For example, Greek, Latin, Armenian, and Gothic are Indo-European languages. On the other hand, Syriac, Coptic, and Arabic are Afro-Asiatic ones. Any comparative analysis of a text in two languages usually produces a great amount of differences due to linguistic patterns specific to each language. However, for an assessment of the overall textual transmission of the New Testament, only those variant readings are significant that may derive from different manuscript evidence. Therefore, any cross-language comparison must be based on a language unifying methodology that enables a distinction between variants due to language requirements and variants due to possible manuscript influence. To study differences on equal footing, such a methodology could be a unifying grammatical framework based on criteria of dependency and valency. Dependency grammar is typically also used in modern computational multilingual analysis and promises therefore to be a huge potential also for the development of digital tools to study any multilingual manuscript attestation. Examples for variants due to language requirements are alternative renderings in Coptic for Greek passive constructions, because the Coptic has no morphological equivalent for the passive voice. Also, alternative renderings in Latin for the present passive participle are an example, because Latin only has an active present participle. In Matthew 2:23, the Greek text here from Nestle Aland 28 reads what translates to, "And having come, he, Jesus, dwelled in a town being called Nazareth." The Latin, here taken from the Stuttgart Vulgate in the 5th edition, reads, "Et veniens habitavit in civitate vocator Nazareth," and coming he dwelt in a town which is called Nazareth. By choosing the present tense participle veniens, here in black and bold, the Latin mirrors the active voice and thus the semantics of the aorist Greek participle elton. However, the Latin cannot mirror the second Greek participle, which is in red, the passive present tense legomenen. Instead of switching the tense to a perfect for a passive perfect participle, we find a relative clause, que vocator. This is a typical rendering for participles functioning as an attribute, and there's nothing to cause suspicion of potential variant readings in a Greek manuscript. On the other hand, significant variants may still be traceable even at places where variants are mainly due to language requirements. And an example for that is the Coptic noun plus circumstantial conversion in Mark 16:4, which translates to, "They saw the stone in that way that they had carried it away from there," which is, of course, the Easter scene at the tomb. In the Greek, Nestle Aland again, there is the predominant reading of a subordinate clause, a dependent statement with hoti. So they see that hoti, the stone, has been rolled away. So the fact that there is this "they have carried it away" in Coptic is not relevant, because the passive cannot be mirrored. But it's interesting that the Coptic could have mirrored the hoti, but doesn't do so. But among the Greek witnesses, there is the monolingual source Codex Sinaiticus, which we have seen already at this conference, and Codex Sinaiticus does not read a hoti clause like the rest of the Greek tradition, but reads an accusativus cum participio, so an accusative with the participle constructions. They see the stone having been rolled away, and this corresponds exactly to what we see in the Coptic, and therefore even here we can see that there may have been an influence from a different manuscript tradition in the Coptic. There would be many more such examples to study these understudied potential relations and interactions between manuscripts and text. And at the Birmingham Colloquium earlier this month, Andrew Patton and Martina Vercesi presented an investigation of the 14th century Latin-Greek bilingual Gregory Aland 629, in which the Latin side of the New Testament text has caused significant alterations to the Greek text. Let's come to some practical challenges. Bilingual manuscripts are unique among all New Testament manuscripts because they provide a verifiable point of contact between individual language traditions. A few bilingual manuscripts have a clear connection or dependence between the two languages. Others derive from different traditions of transmissions with little and only secondary influence between each other. Yet this broad variety of possible interaction mirrors the situation of the overall New Testament manuscript transmission at large. Bilinguals preserve in each codex a microcosm of the textual practices which characterize the textual tradition more broadly. This makes them an ideal subset of manuscripts to investigate typical multilingual patterns at large. Therefore, it is almost surprising that bilinguals have never been studied with full attention to their bilingual character. One of the reasons why this has not been the case resides in the fact that the standard systems for New Testament manuscript identification do not signal whether a manuscript witnesses a text in two languages. Bilinguals with Greek as one of their languages are listed in the standard catalogue of all extant Greek New Testament manuscripts, the so-called Kurzgefasste Liste. This catalogue classifies manuscripts according to material, papyrus, script, majuscule or minuscule, as well as textual scope and purpose, like lectionaries. This has been criticized, but it's still the fact. Bilinguals are distributed between these four categories without any indication that they feature more than one language. For example, P41 is a Greek Coptic papyrus fragment from the 8th century containing parts of Acts. GA012, the Greek Latin Codex Boernerianus from the 9th century, is a majuscule containing Pauline epistles in Greek and Latin. GA628, on the other hand, is a 14th century Greek Latin bilingual minuscule, and GAL2211 is a Greek Arabic lectionary from the 10th century. Nothing in their sigla tells you that it's bilingual. This entails several consequences. Without sigla that portray the bilingual character of a New Testament manuscript, recognizing the bilingual material as such is made difficult. In the text critical apparatus of scholarly editions, bilinguals are almost doomed to slip the attention of scholars. Often bilinguals are treated like monolingual sources, causing their text critical potential for the study of relations of manuscripts and readings to be easily overlooked. For example, in 1 Corinthians 10:19, the Greek word order in the Greek tradition is t estin, but there's the word order estin t in the bilinguals, GA06, 010, and 012, the former DFG, as you can find them in the apparatus. And this is against the rest of the Greek tradition, and it's most likely influenced by the Latin tradition, but concretely the Latin counterpart in the same manuscripts. So here are the threes, and you can see in the first instance they all have est aliquid, so the verb before the aliquid, and also at the second instance the same word order but with slightly different words according to the Greek. Nothing in the critical apparatus of Nestle Aland 28 allows a scholar of the New Testament to see this connection. And another, even more interesting example is 1 Corinthians 15:50, where the participle ga, enim, is read instead of de autem in the same three bilingual manuscripts, but the Latin equivalents are not listed in the apparatus of the Nestle Aland 28. And here the standard Latin reading goes with the Nestle Aland, but in two of these three bilinguals. And it's interesting that Codex Augiensis, the one in the middle, reads here the standard Latin form autem. But if you remember when I talked about Abschriften, I said that this Latin of Codex Augiensis is not influenced by the other ones. So there are fantastic connections that are still out there for us to be studied. So connected with this is yet another practical challenge. The kurzgefasste Liste includes, although unmarked, all New Testament bilinguals which have Greek as one of their two languages. Scholarship on their versional counterpart, however, may have a different siglum for the same manuscript, and we have also seen this already when talking about the Septuagint. In addition, a significant number of bilinguals are preserved in languages other than Greek. One of the few attempts to gain a broader picture on bilinguals is Metzger's concise checklist of New Testament manuscripts written in more than one language from 1984, which also contains bilinguals in Latin Gothic, Syriac Arabic, and Coptic Arabic. This list is in need for an update. The ERC Bicross project at KU Leuven currently aims at providing a catalogue of all bilingual New Testament manuscripts before the 15th century and the invention of print. To circumvent the problem of various sigla in various disciplines, the catalogue will be hosted by Trismegistos, an interdisciplinary platform of the ancient world, and with a unique TM Trismegistos number for each artifact, there will be a unique, supradisciplinary system to refer unambiguously to a multilingual manuscript without giving preference to one language over the other, and at the same time, the information of other traditional sigla will of course be kept. The work on the catalogue is ongoing, and while certain basic information on bilinguals is already present in the Trismegistos platform, the project aims for a release of a better version of the catalogue in autumn 2025. Let's talk about physical characteristics of bilingual manuscripts. With the lack of a complete catalogue, there has also been a lack of systematic studies of physical patterns of bilinguals. Well known is the famous saying by Westcott and Hort that knowledge of documentary evidence must precede the choice of readings. However, one of the many understudied characteristics of bilingual manuscripts is their mise-en-page and the manner in which the two languages are presented. For Greek-Latin bilinguals, David Parker has noted two basic formats with various sub-layouts. A parallel structure with the Greek text usually on the left, like in Codex Bezae, or alternatively an interlinear structure with the Latin in slightly smaller script, like here in Codex Boernerianus. Already in 1992, David Parker pointed out, and I'm going to read this long citation, an analysis of the physical characteristics of bilingual manuscript traditions has yet to be made. Such an undertaking would be a valuable contribution to our knowledge of ancient manuscripts. At present, we can hardly advance beyond seeking for the correct questions to be asked. Are there links between the different groups of bilinguals, for instance, between those in Greek and Coptic and those in Greek and Latin? Can particular sizes of book be discerned? Can layouts on the page, rules with regard to use of scripts for running titles, colophons, and choir signatures be discerned? Are there different practices for bilinguals written for different purposes or according to their contents? How is a copyist's writing style affected by the adjacent scripts? What are the typical corruptions of a bilingual tradition? In what ways may it be superior to a monolingual one? Is there any continuity between ancient Carolingian and Renaissance Greco-Latin manuscripts? Or in other words, was there a preferred way for presenting text in two languages in late antiquity, in medieval times, and in early modern times? Perhaps, yet at this point, the data from bilingual New Testament evidence seems too inclusive for final judgments. Looking at the Greek-Latin evidence only, all formats are attested in medieval times, with a presentation of the text usually in two columns being the predominant model. Noticeable is also an interest in an interlinear one-page format in medieval times, where translations are added on the same page, in particular in the early Middle Ages. Interlinear bilingual manuscripts were either designed as such a bond production, or the interlinear translation was added at a later point. Most famous among New Testament interlinear manuscripts upon production are mid-9th century Codices Sangalensis for the Gospels and Codex Boernerianus for the Pauline epistles. An example for a later edition of an interlinear translation can be found in Gregory Arland 457, which contains the Praxapostolos, about which we've heard in many papers now. A Latin interlinear translation, very, very small here in black, was added later only on folios 82 recto to 253 verso, where it abruptly ends, even before the end of the page, in 1 Timothy 4:3. The picture would change quickly when extending the view on bilinguals beyond the New Testament, because bilingual Psalter manuscripts, for example, offer a great variety of facing pages, interlinear, and multi-column presentations. The addition of bilinguals in other languages than Greek and Latin would also broaden the picture further. Radiciotti, in his study from 1998, considers the Middle Ages a time of experimenting in book production and observes an increase in the single-page codex format. This would ultimately, so Radiciotti, lead to our modern forms of bilingual editions of works where the original language of a writing is usually also on one side and its translation on the other. However, from a sole New Testament perspective, such a pattern is not immediately recognizable. Looking only at Greek-Latin bilinguals that are preserved from the Middle Ages, one would rather come to the conclusion that presenting the text in two columns with one language on the left and one on the right had become the standard form. Observations like these, I think, stress how important interdisciplinary studies are, and they also reveal the need to look at one's data in the broader context of its cultural and historical developments, which is one of the many reasons why I'm so glad to be here and look forward to learning much more from the papers to come. My sixth point, purposes of bilingual manuscripts. There are several other unanswered questions when looking at bilingual manuscripts. One of them is their actual purpose. How codices, whether bilingual or not, were used and reused is a long debated issue. Two main purposes and fields of application have been suggested for bilingual manuscripts, either a liturgical or a scholarly use. Both presuppose some level of language proficiency or at least awareness of both languages on the part of the user. Yet there is not one answer as to why one would produce a bilingual New Testament manuscript. While one may not be wrong to assume that the general purpose of lectionaries was to read from them in liturgical settings, the question why one would need readings from the Bible in two languages is less obvious to answer. Should one envision a bilingual community? If so, in what sense? And would, for example, a truly bilingual community need the same text in two languages? A scholarly interest, in particular language learning, is known from other bilingual documents from antiquity. Certain features have been identified to potentially reveal a scholarly purpose of a literary text. For example, arranging the text in sense lines, that is, in corresponding sense units of various lengths, is such a feature, and already yesterday in the discussion this was mentioned, and also the article by Eleanor Dickey. Another example is text alignment in columns. Both are known strategies for language learning already in antiquity. An example for a New Testament bilingual written in corresponding units, in this case word by word, is Codex Laudianus from the 6th century. Yet whether a scholarly purpose is always given when sense lines are present in bilingual codices is questionable. Perhaps there were also more practical considerations at hand, for example, allowing the scribes to predict the space needed for writing the text in two languages. Both scholarly interest and liturgical use are possible for bilinguals of all formats, so continuous text but also lectionaries. Although issues of practicality need to be considered, a codex of a certain size and weight, and we have seen big ones, may have proven too voluminous and heavy for handling in a liturgical setting. So far, studies of the use and reuse of bilinguals have only been conducted on individual Greek-Latin bilinguals, which does not allow for a conclusive assessment of bilinguals at large. After all, the purpose may also be dependent on the production and reception history of the codex. For example, in the case of Codex Bezae, David Parker again writes, the very low number of corrections made to both columns, in his case both pages, at once is worthy of note. This, coupled with the fact that each corrector made almost all of his corrections in only one column, meaning one page, prompts us to wonder how much Codex Bezae was ever used as a bilingual book. Overall, like any codex, also bilingual codices may have had more than one life, and their initial purpose may be different from that of later users. It has also been suggested that in later times, a bilingual codex may have been an object of prestige. This may, for example, have been the case for the luxury Greek Latin minuscule 16 with rich illustrations, and here is one of them. The codex was most likely commissioned by the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII as a gift to Pope Gregory X in the 13th century. These few examples should suffice to illustrate that the purpose of bilingual manuscripts is not always immediately clear or may have changed over time. Coming to my final point, an outlook and hopes for the future. So what remains now is a brief look into the future. One particularly promising area of research for the study of bilingual manuscripts is the application of digital tools. Electronic developments have had a huge impact on New Testament textual criticism as a discipline. Today, massive textual information of biblical manuscripts can be gathered and stored in a universally shareable and reusable way. High-resolution digital images permit researchers to compare manuscripts which are dispersed between different institutions. More and more holding institutions have started to launch their own virtual manuscript rooms, and with the help of research centers, offer electronic transcriptions in open access. These collaborations have introduced an international encoding standard for transcriptions in TEI and XML format to ensure longevity and sustainability. The digital age has thus reinforced the potential for scholarly collaboration through the sharing of images, data, and knowledge. In terms of bilingual manuscripts, much can be expected from the use of artificial intelligence, in particular natural language processing, NLP, and large language models, LLM. Robert Turnbull, a member of the ERC Bicross project from the University of Melbourne in Australia, is currently seeking ways to simultaneously process multilingual data and to compare various languages on equal footing. With such approaches, it is hoped that several of the challenges outlined in my paper today can be revisited from a fresh perspective and that new insights can be gained. There would be more to say, for example, on the potential of bilinguals to help us solve well-known problems in New Testament studies related to the so-called Western readings, but this needs to wait for another day. For now, let me summarize my main points. My paper today has focused on challenges connected to studying bilingual New Testament manuscripts. In my first point, I've spoken about the big four challenges that are typical for the study of any large text corpus preserved on manuscripts: contamination, corrections, coincidence, and incompleteness of the attestation. To these, I have added then the challenges connected with the history of scholarship of individual languages and translations of the Bible. Scholarship on New Testament versions is not on equal footing in terms of attention and results. While Greek and Latin have gained centuries of attention, others, such as Coptic and Arabic, are still building momentum. In my third point, I focused on challenges arising from comparing two languages on an equal footing, in particular languages belonging to different language families. I highlighted the importance of distinguishing between different readings deriving from differing language requirements and those potentially deriving from differing exemplars. My fourth point highlighted practical challenges when studying bilinguals and the need for a complete catalogue with a universal labeling system, which is currently brought together by the Bicross project, and we are looking at a figure between 130 and 200 bilinguals over the time. In my fifth point, I focused on some typical physical patterns of bilingual manuscripts and their different mise-en-page and the ways in which the two languages are presented. Further interdisciplinary studies are needed to gain a fuller picture of patterns, including also manuscripts containing other writings than the New Testament. In my sixth point, I reflected on the potential purposes of bilingual manuscripts, an area of research which deserves more attention in the future and for which I look forward to learning more during this conference. My last point named a few of the more exciting developments to come, processing bilingual manuscripts data with the help of digital tools that promises new insights and possibilities for cross-language analysis. Overall, the study of New Testament bilingual manuscripts is embedded in the broader research on the New Testament textual tradition and the history of book production. While my paper today has primarily focused on examples from medieval bilingual manuscripts, one could challenge this perspective by instead seeking to enlarge the vision with the larger historical context. As I said earlier, several of the bilingual witnesses from the early medieval times are directly connected to those of earlier centuries. There's still much research to be done. New technologies, digital tools, and interdisciplinary collaborations offer opportunities to deepen our understanding further. We live in exciting times for manuscript studies, and the best is yet to come. Thank you for your attention. Grazie, grazie a lei.
No, lei è stata puntualissima.
Thank you so much. You were perfect on time. We thank you so much for this very interesting lecture that shows how on the issue about bilingual text. And so from late antiquity to early Middle Age, we have a lot of testimonies on which we still have to reflect. The Corpus Juris and Civilis, the acts of the different concilia and their contemporary Greek and Latin versions. There are some points on which a lot has been said and discussed. So now we see all these aspects from our side, which is a very relaxed side, but we have to recall that sometimes they were not so peaceful issues. So, um, fortunately, I don't have much knowledge on this. So thank you so much for the two first speakers who were perfectly on time. And now we can have a 15-minute break, 17-minute break, not more. So please be on time because we will have another lecture by Professor Schmerkel who will open the next session. So thank you, and we will resume at 10:45.
scherzo perché vorrebbe dimostrare che anche io non parlo della mia lingua, è sempre uno sforzo di parlare in un altro ambito e così.
No, ma ognuno
Sottolinea
dovrebbe
tutte
poter
le
parlare nella
questioni.
sua lingua, secondo me, perché allora, dunque ci siamo però, ci siamo o no? Sì, ci siamo? Sì,
Ora
anche
est.
in un minuto di ritardo. Benissimo. Allora, gentili signore,
Dear ladies and gentlemen, okay, let's resume with the speech by Professor Smeckel from the University of Bonn. The speech will be on justice and verity as the foundation of a first European public order from antiquity to the Middle Ages. Please, you have the floor. Mr. President, thank you very much. I would like to thank you all for inviting me. It is a great honor for me, a real joy to be here for the very first time in Spoleto, meeting friends and colleagues from a very long time. And it is a demonstration of tolerance and patience from your side. And because you are accepting a student of Herman Nels.
Long been seen as an expression of a uniform Germanic legal thought, especially in the time of the 19th century nationalism and the National Socialism of the 20th century. Consequently, the question of a Christian influence was excluded. Fortunately, Hermann Nielsen explored the influence of the Old and the New Testament on several occasions, which he summarized once again in 2006. He based his insights on the results of a lifetime research into the early medieval Lxxii. The problem in dealing with this topic was the overly generalized research question, which sought to link several libraries of text from different territories and centuries with a wealth of legal topics. In order to limit my task, it makes sense to specify the questions more precisely. In material terms, the focus is on legal text, whether by secular or ecclesiastical authors, and primarily on laws which other legal literature are being considered primarily on laws. From a chronological point of view, this conference was requested to cover the first European order, that is, the kingdoms on the soil of the Western Empire. This excludes late Roman legal text, from my point of view, but still includes the Carolingian Empire. Only in the written version it is possible to take a final look also on the English and Lombard text. Chronological order is important, which has to include also the Irish tradition in order to get a better view, and the diversity of the findings with regards to the region, century, and culture, etc., should be underlined. No law should be taken as a proof as an unyielding cultural identity, and no longer any sort of ethnic arithmetic can be convincing, so that we can conclude from one tradition to the other. In the same way, Christianity changed in the course of the time, just as Roman law and the Germanic reigns. The Christian doctrine evolved from the late Roman Empire clearly to the Middle Ages, and for the beginning I just referred to the notion of katechon, which was important in the first centuries. It should not be forgotten, furthermore, that not all Christians followed the same denomination, and the Council of Nicaea ended the schism between the Homoousians, who were Orthodox afterwards, and the Homoousians, who followed Arius and saw Jesus less as God than as a prophet. And of course, the parties still tended to treat each other as heretics. In order to determine the Christian influence, it is not sufficient to look out for citations from the Bible. This is how I started my topic, until I found out that until the Collectio Canonum Ibanensis, these texts did not quote the Bible. So I had to look out for a different strategy. For establishing the Christian influence on the so-called Leges Barbarorum, following P2, the focus here is led instead on the reception of the ideas of the Church Fathers as far as the administration of justice is concerned. With regard to the sin of lawlessness, the creation of law itself could be seen already as a sign of Christianity. This risks, however, losing sight of the difference between the Roman and Christian traditions. In order to make the legal question more precise, the organizer allowed me the focus to be placed on procedural questions. This was a topic that had already appeared important to the Church Fathers since Constantine, and whose themes were also adopted by the laws. The aim is to build on our own publications on the emergence of European Roman canonical procedural law and the law of evidence from the spirit of the Church Fathers. In this way, the ideas of the Church Fathers can be discovered with the help of distinctive concepts such as justice and truth. As has often been shown, the judgment of God in the last judgment served as a model for the Church Fathers. God, who loves justice, will judge everyone according to their deeds in the last judgment. A good judge should endeavor, like God, to ascertain the full truth of a case. God's justice will also serve as the standard for the last judgment, where justice and truth will finally be revealed. In this view, judges were regarded as judges of a preliminary court that was to prepare the last judgment. Like God, they had to try to ascertain the truth in order to pass a just judgment. What had been condemned by the human judge should not be punished again by God. So this is quite clear that we do not find these ideas in the civil laws before true Christianization. And we start to find these findings, these observations, these notions in the Germanic text. And I will start with the most problematic text, of course, having in view my colleagues from Milan, the Edictum Theodorici. If it really originates from Theodoric the Great, it could be analyzed in order to understand the Ostrogothic Empire around 500. And let me present just two arguments to take over this view from my master, that is, that if we compare the Edictum Theodorici with writings by Cassiodor in the Mosaicarum Romanorum Legum Collatio, one sees that the survival of a wealth of Roman forms of administration, for example, taxation and the written administration of the laws of will, was still quite important. And the second argument is that we find a certain variety of religions in the Italian Ostrogothic Empire due to the fact that the influence of Christianity and the two different denominations present in Italy had not the final Christianization effect that we find in other countries. So the Edictum Theodorici fits well into Italian society, according to my view. Although a clear distinction was made between barbarians and Romans in the text, the written form was widely recognized in this society. There were obviously also enough Romans who could represent someone in the court at any time, especially as barbarians were not allowed to assume the position of a legal counselor. The compiler had a clear idea of a properly organized legal procedure, and I found that some historians do not notice this legal coherence of the Dictum Theodorici and thought that the Visigothic laws were organized in a wonderful way. Of course, we find the titles and the books in the order of the Visigothic laws. But if you have a look at these titles, you find quite a different set of ideas and ideas which are regulated there. Whereas the compiler of the Edictum Theorici had a very clear idea what should come next to any given text in this small text. And of course, we don't know what P2 found in his text, and if there were another texts which had titles. So this is just something we don't know. Even if there was not yet the talk of ordines judiciari, there was already an idea that by no means arbitrary order in court should prevail, and that there was the necessity of the appeal. And Harald Siems has shown just now that discussio in that period meant a certain order of legal procedure and thus prefigured the notion of ordines judiciarii. Moreover, the dictum shows a more remarkable coherence, and this is something which shows me the legal quality of the text. Ostrogothic law did not quote from the Bible, nor did it use terms such as justice and truth. Only brief and general references are made to goals such as peace and compliance with the law. The beginning with the requirements for the judge thus dispensed with established terms, but not with emphasizing the ideas behind them. Apparently, the new ideas were not yet established, or the teachings of the Church Father so generally accepted that the law could take them for granted. In this respect, the Edictum Theorici fits well, according to my findings, into the Italy of Theodoric the Great. If I would locate it, though, to Spain, I would have to explain still a greater problem with regard to the obvious differences in the Visigothic texts. Already at the beginning, the Visigothic laws emphasized the role of the church in establishing civil order and for the kings to defend the church. The king was authorized to punish bishops and judges with a limited toleration of Jews and the persecution of heresy. Christianity dominated much more clearly than in the Ostrogothic kingdom. The church thus participated in the administration of the kingdom, and increasingly so in the later centuries. No quotations from the Bible can be found, though, in the law and the areas relevant here, but the councils had an influence as well on procedural law. The law was held in particular esteem, and it was so highly praised, like in Leges Visitorum 1:2, with the famous text where it was called the rival of divinity, the oracle of religion, source of discipline, artist of law, creator and promoter of good morals, leader of the community, ambassador of justice, leader of life, and the soul of the whole body politic. No one should ignore, therefore, the law. The legislation spends a great deal of effort determining the requirements for a just judge. The virtues of judges are listed. The position of the bishops, who are allowed to admonish unjust judges with paternal piety, is also different. Justice becomes a dominant category. All misbehavior or offenses in this field are described as unjust. Overall, the Visigothic collection of laws served to define justice in all its facets. The judge is instructed to carefully search for and evaluate the evidence. The initial aim was to find regular evidence. Only if this was not successful should the oath be taken at the end of the proceedings. And these proceedings should be conducted until the truth is found. I will skip the Rome law text and come to the ecclesiastical tradition. With Recared's conversion, Roman Catholicism became the basis of the Visigothic kingdom and of all subjects, regardless of their origin. The Visigothic kings increasingly defined their role in terms of Christian faith. Theological considerations more and more influenced the understanding of their position. Justice was therefore to shape the law. This was prescribed by the Bible. The production of just laws according to these guidelines were seen as the task of the king. For this reason, the laws also had to protect the king in his position of supremacy. The fulfillment of this task was probably also sworn by the kings when they took office. In the Third Council of Toledo of 589, King Recared was described as a holy prince, as the pure breath of God, and he was given the title of an orthodox king, a title used already by the Eastern emperors. The new king was admonished to always make the right decision, using a play on words with rex, king, and recte, right. Rex, eius eris, si recte facis, si autem non facis, non eris. So, meaning that if you will be king if you do right, but if you do not, you will not be. This was probably a proverb. Overall, there was a growing harmony between the king and the church, and it gradually changed the image of the prince. Wamba, who was the first king to be anointed with an oil after his election in 672, not only in the Visigothic kingdom, but in the Christian tradition in general. This gave him legitimacy from the church, which compensated for his lack of royal vote and descendants. This meant that the anointed king had to fulfill the duties of a Christian monarch. This king was not just a representative of God like Constantine, but was now responsible for upholding justice and truth in the kingdom. A strong monarch, as ruler and legislator, could control the courts and churches and thus demonstrate that he was fulfilling his duties. King Wamba himself issued a law on the behavior of bishops in which he described God as a righteous judge who eternally loves justice and wants to protect justice. Since God himself is justice, it would be crazy to violate these rules. Isidore of Seville emphasized that the king shows his people the right path as just as and a legislator. If he strayed from the right path, he would lose his position. This statement is repeated in Isidore's Etymologia. And once again, we hear rex eris, si recte facias, si non facias non eris. Isidore claims that this old proverb, in fact, he took this idea from St. Augustine. The judgments of God, if we come now to the Burgundian tradition, the law is very famous for its ordeal and the combat. Here, this law was also used to assert the specific identity of the Burgundians. It is true, however, that divine judgments already existed in antiquity. However, the Christian doctrine against duels and judgment of God only developed in the 9th century, even if there were already doubts about these practices before then, particularly in the Lombard laws, Liutprand, for example. The starting point for theological criticism, really based on thorough theology, can be found only in the 9th century and was based on the idea of God's omnipotence, which could also accept injustice, as in the case of Job. But for Constantine and Clovis, their victory in their time, their victory in battle, was still the divine confirmation of their power, through which their rule was legitimized. On the one hand, this was based on the idea that God, devils, demons, and saints could all intervene in daily life, and on the other hand, that there was often a relationship between right behavior and success. That's what my colleagues from the divinity school in Germany call the Tun-Ergehens-Zusammenhang, so that success could be seen as a reward for the pious Christian. In doing so, reference was made to John 14:6, that God himself is truth. Karl Ubel sees in the laws of Theodoric, Uric, and Gundobad, an alternative, competing versions of legislation. If the, Even if clear differences in style can be identified in the perspective chosen here, they do not differ fundamentally, but rather gradually and subtly. The Visigoths emphasized justice like no nation before them, while the Burgundians only hinted at the by now well-established idea. Let me come to Ireland, which has often been neglected by um, earlier legal historians. The most important of the early text here is called Senchas Mar. It is said in the mythical origin of this tradition that St. Patrick mixed Irish law with the Old and New Testament. However, already in this text, we find that the king is admonished not to judge wrongly. Particularly, attention is paid to the trial. A distinction was made between the proceedings of the kings, the bishops, and the church, and secular proceedings. However, in all these proceedings, written rules and evidence were required. In the search for rules of law, the Old Testament kings served as models. A Liber ex lege Moises was created around 700, and the latest in which the legal provisions of the Old Testament that were still seen as valid in the author's opinion were collected. A central term in the sources for this matter is fir, which is accounted to be the equivalent of true. The aim was to convict criminals, which could also be achieved through divine judgment. Truth, justice, and nature were seen as the three paths to judgment. Here again, the ideal of truth was established as the hallmark of procedural justice. It is therefore not surprising that some authors actually regarded the Bible, especially the Old Testament, as the main source for this early Irish law. The texts show a number of different judges from the secular and the spiritual spheres at different levels. However, the Irish kings were named as the highest judge, who were expected to have a range of skills that were prerequisites for their jurisdiction. Just judgments were one of the central duties. Unjust judgments led to their disposition. Kings were to prepare their judgment with an elder or legal expert or a scribe, and the scribe may have served to take the laws into account. Anyone who wanted to take action against royal judgments could have themselves and their livestock fasted. The misery of the land was understood as a sign of divine wrath, and the king therefore had to change his judgment for fear of God's vengeance on himself. There were obviously also widespread discussions about the legality of the decisions. If a few days were often granted to appeal against a judgment, judges sought advice, the kings, from judges, bishops, or experts. With regard to ecclesiastical law, we see that pastoral care for the local population became a central part of the special Irish monastical tradition. Very early on, this endeavor gave rise to these famous manuals for confession, the penitentials, which were intended to specify the possible deeds and penances. The first text may have been or may have originated already in Wales in the 5th century. Later, the manuals themselves became a model for the secular administration of criminal justice. Confession is based here on the inner will. Even the attempt can be equated with the deed itself. The confessor recognizes and repents of his sins through his confession. Penances are intended to indicate the inner repentance. This gave the monks much tighter control of the behavior of their subject and the Christianization of the country. The similarity to criminal proceedings is obvious, and the influence on them in the following centuries is considerable. The Canones Valizi, perhaps from Brittany, also focused very early on determining the truth. Irish canon law, the Collectio Canonum Hibernensis, was created by learned clerics in the beginning of the 8th century and is based on extracts from the Bible, especially Moses, the church father, and Irish law. With regard to the cases of Solomon and David, it is explained that judgments must reflect the truth of the case in order to preserve the justice of the land. The assumption that the unjust king is unsuitable for his office corresponds to the Old Testament ideas. In the books of Moses and the historiography of Solomon, we find the general idea that the king passes on divine justice to his people by condemning the guilty and rewarding the righteous. The king was to restore God's peace. God would not allow the guilty to win the case. The guilty must be punished. The innocent must be set free. Solomon therefore asked God that the kings of Israel would always judge the wicked and bring justice to the righteous. Only through this injustice, through this justice, could man lead a prosperous life in society. The early Christians in Ireland thus oriented themselves on the jurisdiction of the Old Testament in order to introduce a Christian jurisdiction into their country. A text written, final proof, in Ireland between 630 and 50 was primarily distributed under the name of St. Cyprian and became known as the Treatise De Duodecim Abusivis Seculi. It dealt with the abuses of old men without religion, young men without obedience, rich people without charity, women without modesty, quarrelsome Christians, bishops who violate their duties, and unjust kings. We will come back to this text later. I have now to affront the Frankish tradition, and coming to the Lexalica, of course, I have to note that there is little to be found here of the Christian tradition. The Franks succeeded in independently merging Roman traditions and Frankish customs. Even the prologue of the Lexalica recognizes neither a lawgiver nor the tradition of Roman law, and we find Christian influence only later. The king and the dignitaries sitting in court in this realm were barely literate. The law, which had to be brought to court, did not necessarily find an audience in the secular world that could read it, as Harazims had already noted. Instead of documents, Frankish law was characterized by formal actions, for example, using a stick, which were intended to bring about the memory of the surroundings. The proximity of legislation and church became only clearer in the further Merovingian history. Olivier Guillot described the increasing tendency of the jurisprudence of Merovingian kings, which is clear from the breviar in the Spanish realm, that the justitia was received only slowly and gradually also in the Frankish text. The following texts show this growing influence of the church in the Frankish Empire, but also demonstrate the continuing lack of knowledge of the church fathers' doctrine on justice. The Rhine Franconian law, the Lex Ripuaria, written around the beginning 7th century under the leadership of St. Cunibert, Bishop of Cologne, contains this famous sentence that Ecclesia vivit lege Romana. We see in the legal code of the Alemanni, Lex Alemanorum, from the first decades of the 7th century, clearly a strong position of the church in this realm, but the law begins here with the creation of the ecclesiastical property and ends with the violation of this property, but we don't find such references to justice as we had in other cases. The law of the Bavarians was probably drawn up in a monastery and follows the model of the Lex Alemanorum, and the prologue outlines the history of law beginning with Moses, and here we slowly get clear and closer. We get closer to what I'm looking for. During the reign, however, of King Dagobert I, the influence of the bishops who followed the new doctrine of the Irish missionaries became particularly evident in the administration of justice. Around 643, the Merovingian rulers finally began to sit in judgment and make decisions in public court assemblies, placita. The placita emphasizes that the decisions were not only made in court, but also in the presence of and by the king and his procurers. Later, it is also underlined that the decision was made justo judicio. The monarch's commitment to duty became even clearer during the change of dynasty in the Frankish Empire in 751, when the mayordomo of the empire, Pippin the Younger, asked Pope Zacharias to accept him as the new king. The Pope decided that it would be better if the man who held the power also should bear the title of the king. On this authority, Pippin was elected and anointed as the new king of Franconia, first by Bishop Boniface, later by Pope Stephen. This rite not only copied the example of Wamba, but was also regarded as the foundation of the Frankish kingdom as the result of the baptism of Clovis. However, the new tradition of royal coronation transferred a central responsibility to the cooperation and approval of the church. Here, the position of the king was regarded for the first time as an office. It was no longer just a matter of heritage, but a public function that needed also the title in order to fulfill all their duties. Kingship acquired an even priestly quality. In 775, the Anglo-Saxon scholar Capwolf reminded Charlemagne of the central qualities of a good monarch. He should choose his advisors carefully to protect his honor, restore public order, eliminate injustice through good laws, and punish wrongdoers with just punishments. In every respect, he had to be regarded as God's servant and guarantor. He was regarded as a ruler in the place of Christ. The king of Franconia, who later became emperor, was obliged to protect the church from its enemies. The Carolingian reform marked the beginning of a new phase in many respects. Alcuin, for example, also shows the influence, once again, for the influence of the Irish-Scottish mission in the Frankish court. Around 820, Archbishop Agobert of Lyon wrote his work, De Grandine et Donitruis, in which he spoke against the use of trials and battles as evidence. For the archbishop, this was by now just superstition. He therefore attacked Gunbad's Burgundian law code with harsh words. The church reform attacked the reputation and validity of these laws long before Justinian's text of Roman law became known again. And here we have the starting of this new theological tradition. In describing the image of a just king, Hincmar of Reims, in his writing on the divorce of King Lothar from 860, referred back to the aforementioned Irish text from the 7th century, De Duodecim Abusivi Seculi. Piety and justice are interpreted here as in a comprehensive sense and regarded as prerequisites for legitimate rule. In taking over this text, Hincmar describes the abuses of the world, including kings and bishops who misuse their office. In particular, a good king must judge justly. Justice thus takes on the meaning of a generic term for pious, God-pleasing, moral behavior that is committed to truth and balance. The description lists the criteria of this justice in detail. This includes judging without regard to the person, protecting the weak, and defending the strong. A judgment is only just if it is true in content and follows the moral judgments of Christianity. In John of Orleans' work, the Institutione Regia from 829, another mirror of the princes, one finds in the same way the demand for royal justice as a prerequisite for the happiness of people. This description seems like an abridged version of the passage quoted by Hincmar. Here too, the Old Testament is used extensively as a model and evidence. The royal court also appears in John of Orleans as a guarantor of the stability of the realm. This shows that Hincmar's understanding of the exemplary prince was shared by his contemporaries. It can be found in Alcuin's Martyrs of Saint Michael, Emoldus Nigellus, and Charles the Bold. Once again, we notice the reception of Irish ideas in the Frankish Empire regarding the position of the king. I will skip for time's sake the Lombard laws and the English legislation, although the English kings emphasized not only their Christianity but also their use of these ideas in court. The question which I tried to answer here was about the influence of Christianity through the Bible and the church on the laws of the Germanic kingdoms on the soil of the late antique empire. The laws analyzed make little or no reference to the Bible. This even applies to the laws of England, although the regulatory content could hardly be more in line with the interests and content of Christianity. The texts of the Bible were not used directly as a model when formulating the laws. There are neither clear quotations nor allusions. Rather, it has already been observed that the narratives of the Old Testament in particular were used in the historical framework, that is, the narrative justifications for the laws in the context of the creation. Examples of this can be found in Gregory of Tours and other historiography. In Ireland in particular, the influence of the Old Testament on legal texts has been proven even after the mythical creation in the time of St. Patrick. The question of scriptural knowledge is clearly different in the various kingdoms and times. It became clear that the mastery of writing by clerics and in the ecclesiastical sphere cannot be used to infer the same in the secular sphere, where warriors and rulers had not yet learned to read, and the ability to write was sometimes only ensured with the help of scribes and other specialists. It cannot be concluded from a society's use of writing that literacy was available in all classes. However, it is clear how much Visigoths and then again Charlemagne sought to intensify their rule with the help of texts. The existence of the Bible in the kingdoms, or even in court, did not necessarily mean that it was read, but the likelihood of this increased over centuries. And the next question was, even if it was read, what would it infer on the jurisdiction? How would they use it? How could they even have the methods of interpreting the Bible in order to derive a proper sentence from it? So this would be a rather modern idea, I assume. A look on the Ostrogothic Empire and the lack of dominance of a Christian church explains why the Edictum Theodorici is still the least characterized by Christian influence. I hope we can convene at least on this. Like the Sunday Commandment, much of it is ambiguous in that it cannot only be interpreted as Christian, but also in the tradition of the Roman Empire, as, for example, the worship of the state god Jupiter as Sol Invictus could also be seen as Christ. The Edictum Theodorici is convincingly composed accordingly to its legal order and is by no means artless. For the purposes of our question, there is at least a marked interest in the regulation of procedural law, which could correspond to a Christian interest, but was obviously not openly expressed. In contrast, Visigothic laws emphasized the Christian faith and the written form, which served to promote knowledge of the Bible as well as the laws. The Christian content is even clearer to observe in the English laws, which I couldn't explain here. This corresponds to the interest of the laws and the task of the king and the judges to pronounce just judgments that correspond to the material truth and thus realize the commandments of justice. To the same extent, ideas of a necessary procedure that must be followed by the court in order to allow justice to emerge. The Irish development shows a completely different Christianity, which placed much greater responsibility on the kings. The Old Testament in particular was used as a source of inspiration. In addition to secular and ecclesiastical law, Ireland even developed its own moral theological literature on the kings and his task of administering justice in the service of righteousness. Many texts were also modeled on the Hibernenses in the use of the Old Testament. The Frankish legislation initially revealed little, and in particular hardly any, Christian influence. This only became clear in the following laws and centuries. This can also be linked to the Irish-Scottish mission in the Frankish Empire, which was active here from the 7th century onwards. This can be seen not only as ideas on justice and administration of justice, but also in the increasing demands placed on the kingship. From the requirements in the administration of justice, one can see the king's obligation to fulfill the duties of his office. Well, we talk here of something rather new, office of the king, to my mind, which were named at the change of the dynasty in 751, and finally in the ideas of a possible deposition of King Lothar II. However, it is not possible to rule out adoptions from Visigothic kingdoms. Alongside the Roman legal tradition, Christianity had a decisive influence on the emergence of Germanic kingdoms in the Western Roman Empire. Due to insufficient knowledge of the Christian ideas of this period, many or most Old Testament influences of the 6th to 8th century have instead been interpreted as evidence of a pagan tradition. However, a comparison with Celtic territories such as Ireland proves how little they differed from the continental edition. But what was called Christian influence in Ireland was called pagan influence on the continent, although it was the same thing. For more than 5 centuries, Germanic has been used in historical research to describe pagan traditions, particularly in contrast to Roman tradition. Due to the Christian influence on the law as a whole since at least the 4th century, we need to rethink this. Insofar as lawmaking in the empire and the kingdoms can be influenced by Christianity and thus be considered less antagonistic. This is not to rule out the existence of specific and characteristic features of their own tradition in the laws of the Germanic kingdoms. However, it is precisely the seemingly pagan elements of the ordeals, royal salvation, and a sacred duty of kings to take revenge that can be recognized as influences from early Christianity. As it has often been emphasized, there are not only influences from the empire and its Roman law, but also Christianity in its late antique manifestation, which has to be taken into account as well. The latter, however, will still need more research, especially not from a simple legal historian, but from the true specialist. Thank you very much for your attention.
Anche il professor Schmekel è stato
Also, Professor Schmeckel was very good in terms of timing, especially. Now, as I should have said at the beginning of this session, after these 3 speeches, we have a discussion, a debate in the order of exposition of the lessons. So once people who wanted to speak had to sign themselves on a paper. Now, normally we raise our hand. So congratulations once again, Professor Schmeckel, for this wide lesson, generous lesson, I would say. And of course, I'm sure that there will be a huge debate after it, after your lesson. Now, I'd like to invite Professor Andrist to come closer. I invite you all from the audience If you have questions, if you want to intervene, please, you have the floor. Until now, it seems there are no questions, no comments, not yet.
Ecco, c'è un intervento. Deve per favore dire...
So please, your name in the mic. Yes, Valentina Schiavon, Pontifical University Antoniana in Rome.
Presentation. And furthermore, I have a question about the architecture of the Codex Purpurus Rostanensis. I would ask you, do you think it is correct to find an interaction between the text and the decoration inside the decoration of the manuscript itself? Because in the pages of the manuscripts, we have a representation of prophets and kings of the Old Testament in the lower part of the decoration, and the prophets and the kings they seem to talk about Christ in the upper part, and they are holding volumina where there is a short text by the Old Testament. So, do you think it's correct to find a correlation between these components of the pages, and if this, in your opinion, this bond, this interaction unify the Old and the New Testament? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. I don't know if it works, and maybe I can speak louder. Okay. Thank you very much for your question. Of course, this is the specific question for this first part of the codex, where the didascalia that you're referring to are presented, and it's clearly for one thing, I will not go answer you in length, because it's a question for the specialists, for, I guess, firstly art historians that are dealing with these questions, and the relation between the three levels that we have in that. So, but I think, of course, there is a relation between these three. They did not produce them independently from one another. It's, for me, it's clearly there was a project behind. And now, how do they came to that? I think there are other examples. You know, the manuscripts were similar approach. And my question is more how this part would relate to the Tetraevangelium that come afterward. There is a logic on the part of the life of Jesus, and there are also the decoration, the judgment, etc., and of Pilatus, and so it's on the. It's clearly it fits well with the New Testament manuscripts and with the Gospel very well. That if it was conceived to be a first part of that, I would still leave the question, I would say, open, since we saw this difference in size, and that's where I'm reaching my limits, I would say, because I wish we had the dimension of all the pages and to see how the layout is really, but precise layout, millimeter precise of all these registers, and so we can try to see if we see some kind of equal thinking, material thinking in both parts or not, and how they relate to one another. This will be more my question. How the three registers interact with one another is a very important one that has been discussed in several articles, but it's not my focus.
There's another comment.
On a similar topic, I wondered, when you said that you have only come across purple manuscripts in biblical tradition, can you be more specific in terms of the texts which they contain? Are purple manuscripts just gospel manuscripts, or do we find purple manuscripts of other biblical books? The reason I ask is because when I was doing the research for my Latin paper, I was struck that we know of many old Latin biblical manuscripts which are purple. Almost all of them are gospel books. The one exception is an early Psalter. And I was wondering whether in Greek tradition we see purple manuscripts only for the Gospels, or whether there are other biblical books which are purple.
Yes, I knew that you told me that you were going to ask the question, so I opened the article of this conference, and I think Professor Bernabo wrote a note about that, and that yeah, there are basically they mention 6 manuscripts in the Greek tradition, and they are this Psalter in Zurich, but then it's mainly New Testament manuscripts with the one we saw, and then the Synop manuscript, the Beratinus manuscripts, and the Codex Petropolitanus. But it must be also, there is a Genesis Vienna that is also in purple manuscripts. And of course, we know that Plinius spoke about purple manuscripts, purple parchment, and of course, he was not referring to New Testament material. And but for one thing, the information he gives us about the origin of it is not confirmed by chemical analysis, for one thing. And for the other thing is it's another time. We're not at the same, speaking of the same centuries, for 500 years in between. And so we could say, I wish we had other examples and we can see the evolution and see how we moved from pagan use, not Christian use of manuscript, to a Christian, exclusively Christian use, or if this is just by chance, maybe that we only have that. I don't know. I just leave it open. But that the facts, and I think it's meaningful that it's maybe one of the few features that the current data we have says this is very typical Christian, typical biblical, even biblical. So let's keep the eyes open.
Paolo Fioretti, grazie. Grazie Patrick.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for this beautiful lesson, which showed once again that paleographic issues are not just a mere description, but they are useful for understanding the real life of these objects. My question is quite simple. You have shown so many cases where the blank space is the limit between two different blocks. Very good. And it is useful for rebuilding the architecture of the manuscript. How do you explain, how do you justify these blank spaces that you showed that sometimes are in a unit and do not coincide with the passage from one block to another physical structure, with structures which are separated? Thank you.
Thank you. I just summarize the question in English. The question was about the empty spaces in the manuscripts when they are within the quires, not at the limit of the quires. How do we account for those? Right? Right. Okay. And I will, for one thing, that these are the most interesting ones, because for one thing, they do not happen by chance. It cannot be just. It can be one maybe distraction, but I don't believe that. And it's ideological. It's maybe we should to be careful with the word ideology, but it's conceived like that. There is an importance for them to have this. And we have this example I showed with the New Testament and the Old Testament. It's clearly the reason why they wanted to have the New Testament to start on a new recto, and it's even in the middle of the choir in this case. Was there more than that? We can say yes, probably. They wanted in this case clearly that we're we're changing the world. We are going from one area to one representation, from Daniel to the New Testament, the New Covenant, the new material. And it was so that's why maybe in this case ideology is not a totally wrong word. But there are other cases, like also in the Vaticanus, for the Psalms. They have this extra space, but one can argue that is for practical reasons in that case, because we are going from a layout in 3 columns to a layout in 2 columns. The Psalms were written with lines that are a little bit longer for the versification, for the representation of the verse, and they decided to start with a new page, made things much easier for them. And in this case, but still, the psalm is Psalter was something important. So it could have both functions. It's not exclusive in this case, I think. Does it answer the question? Okay, great. Yes.
Thank you, José Francisco Fonseca from the University of São Paulo. My question is for Professor Schmuckel on the question of the Bible and justice. Can you hear me?
No, sure, sir.
I think that we should finish with the questions for the first speaker, and then we will move to the second and third speakers. So I would like to invite you all, if you have questions on the speech by Professor Andrist, if you have questions or comments, you can raise them. Otherwise, we can move to the next speech, next lesson, and then we will have our conclusions. I apologize for being a bit authoritative, I would say. Okay, here we are. So questions for the speech by Professor Kreinecker.
Viktor Golinets, Hochschule für Jüdisch Heidelberg. Thank you for your presentation, and especially the typology, the proposed typology of bilingual manuscripts was very interesting for me, because coming from the Hebrew or Jewish studies, I look in the kind of jealousy of what you have done in your field, because in the Jewish realm we have a lot of bilingual manuscripts, Hebrew Aramaic, Hebrew Arabic, and we have also trilingual manuscripts, biblical manuscripts, Hebrew with Aramaic and with the Arabic translation, and we don't know how many they are. They have no typology. We don't know what are the oldest ones, so it's very interesting to see that you in the New Testamental studies have such a thing, so we can use it maybe as a role model to copy it in our field. We know from the ancient world, from the Near Eastern ancient world, that the bilingual text or multilingual text were attested in Babylonia, in Ugarit, in Hittite realm. So there is an old tradition, but it's something special, I think, that we have a sacred text in the Christian time or in Jewish time, the sacred text in different languages. So do you know, does anybody know what is the oldest manuscript with more than one text of sacred scriptures, for instance?
Well, thank you very much. There's so much to comment on, and I share your questions basically to some extent. Let me say some things and then also broaden to the audience. Well, there is the same problem, which is why we are starting now to try to systematize those manuscripts. And one of my collaborators, Dr. Maxime Maleux, he's currently looking at all those bilinguals that don't have Greek, because for some reason New Testament scholars have been more interested in those with Greek. And he finds them, and many more than are known, but they are known to those people who have worked with them, but not systematized. There are also some trilingual ones, but we have excluded them to keep sane in our mind, basically. But I showed one of another team quickly in one of my pictures in the last point on the digital one that was GA 460 with the Humarek project, where they have digitalized it with Greek, Latin, and Arabic, and it's also super fascinating. So we have those, but the day only has 24 hours. How many is also an open question, because also with working Coptic, for example, you then see, oh, this belongs together, and then the number goes down, and then you find new ones. For the bilingual situation, a sacred text is a question I can't answer, but I have looked at bilingual moments from documentary evidence, and that is attested then in everyday life in Egypt already, with the Greek, Demotic and Greek. And that I find fascinating, because in all this everyday evidence, there's always the real need of having it in another language. And one example is that a plate is mentioned on, it's not the plate that is preserved, but the mention of the plate in a text that is on a door that says no trespassing. And it says that in more than one language because it needs to be understood. And I wonder about these sacred texts, particularly for the later bilinguals, whether this is more like prestige, just because we can do it. We see an increase of bilinguals in the 15th century, where, to say it a bit bluntly, it's just showing off already, and all these more languages then later on with printed versions because you can do it. But I wonder whether the initial need, also for the New Testament ones, in Greek and Coptic being older than the Greek and Latin that are preserved, whether it was a genuine need of having a translation. I wonder. But is there anybody who can answer to the other question? What is the oldest one? I don't know.
Thank you. So your note about the inscriptions reminds me of Palmyrenic inscriptions, where we have in Palmyra a lot of dedicatory inscriptions in Palmyrenic Aramaic with the Greek translations, sometimes with the Latin translations, and sometimes also with three different texts on one stele, which maybe we could imagine a bigger project in the interdisciplinary project, looking how the transition from not the transition, how the use of bilingual, multilingual text in different realms also has how to say prompted to produce manuscripts with more than one text, more than one language.
It's super fascinating, because I talked with the people from Trismegistus who have all the documentary evidence, and they have shown me text with Latin, Etruscan, and these kind of bilingual inscriptions also on gravestones. So where the tombs where you want to have your identity shown, it's just fascinating. Yeah, we can go deep and long and all day.
Joseph Dyer, just a very short observation that we do have an example from Jesus' time of a multilingual text, which is what Pilate wrote over the cross.
Which is also only mentioned, of course, as a text. And it's interesting that the trilingual situation, these three languages, I could never find anywhere in documentary evidence. So it seems to have a literary religious purpose as well. But that's what got me started many years ago, this mention of the three languages. Also, the sequence is a bit odd, because Greek should come way sooner. So yeah, it's fascinating. But we do have evidence in Josephus. I think it is on these bilingual inscriptions on the temple or outside the temple, so that you do not enter. But I think, yes, exactly. It's not bilingually preserved, but it's mentioned that it was bilingual. So yeah, there's this difference between what is mentioned and what is actually preserved. It's also fascinating.
Thank you, Patrick Andres from Munich. Thank you again for your presentation. I think it's fascinating. And as we said before, what is surprising is that little has been done for such a huge potential for even for text critics and so on. And I'm looking, of course, at it as a book historian, and it was not a surprise to see that you were using Codex Buernerianus and the Sengel 48 which are from the same come from the same Irish background, Irish monasteries. But there is a third manuscript from the same family in Basel, which I happened to work on, to describe in another life, which is Basel A74, I think, or something. I can give you the address, which is a psalter, a psalm, a psalterium, and has exactly the same goal. And at the time when I was describing this manuscript, I was interested a little bit in this question of where do they get where did they get the Greek? And as far as I remember, these people could not read Greek. There were Irish monks that were they had Greek manuscripts, obviously, and they copied it very, I wouldn't say faithfully, but as a sacred, as a pious thing. But they could not understand. So the Greek is terrible, and it's. I remember an article saying that it was just useless for text critics. So I wonder. My question is, of curiosity, are there new works doing on that problematics? That how far we can use that Greek, for judging, also for judging the translation, how can we use this material at the bottom line?
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, those interlinears are super fascinating, and I know there are more, particularly when it comes to the Old Testament. So thank you for also pointing out the Psalter one. I have looked at them not so much on judging whether the Greek is any good, but they're fascinating from a Latin perspective in those instances where the Latin ad hoc translation is different than the rest of the Latin tradition. And that is easily explained because it follows the Greek. And in those instances that I looked, the Greek text was also acknowledged in other manuscripts. So I did not spot that phenomenon. Two more things on that to say. One thing is that we are in the privileged situation to look at the material now broader is also because other people have focused on the individual aspects, individual languages, individual manuscripts before. So we stand on the shoulders of giants, as is so often said. But when I spoke and when my colleagues spoke about some interlinear aspects in these manuscripts, in the research unit at my institution, there were people from the Old Testament who said, oh, I've worked on that, it's terrible because there's so much missing and so on. And I thought, that's not what I see in the New Testament. So I wonder whether it would also be worth, again, not being that only New Testament, but looking at it more broadly, because I have not spotted that. And the second one I wanted to say is behind you is sitting somebody who has worked much more on interlinears, Hugh Houghton. So I wonder whether in the discussion now or later there may be more to gain from that. But yeah, so I refer to others on that. But I find that there is sometimes individual Latin readings not attested anywhere else, just showing that they genuinely followed the Latin, the Greek, and the Greek is not strange, the Latin is strange in that sense. But still correct Latin, of course, and just one reason why we want to study them even more. But thank you for the hint.
Prima di sollecitare, prego, no, volevo soltanto.
I would like to remind you all, when intervening, to say your name and surname, because then the discussions are reported in the papers. Not always this is done. In some cases, it is necessary.
University of Cyprus. Thank you for your presentation. If we get into later times, that is after 1204, could these Greek Latin manuscripts serve as tools of propaganda or, let's say, on the side of the Latins, that is, in an attempt to familiarize the Greek, so to speak, world with the Latin rites and everything?
Well, thank you. I think there is a discussion on whether, there ever was this contest between making one language more holy than the other. But personally, I cannot really see it. But what I find interesting with the Greek and Latin is that indeed there are these of periods where you find bilinguals preserved, so it could be coincidence. But there is this time in the 14th and then also in the 15th century when we get more bilinguals again in the Greek and Latin, but then with what as a textual scholar I would say an inferior text. So then it's really more, perhaps also more illustrations or more decorations. And so clearly the interest wasn't so much in the text, it's often in just the standard ones, be it more on however we are going to call it on the standard majority side. I'm very careful now on my wording. And on the Latin side, often the Vulgate. And we also see in these later ones that the sense line and the alignment is not as clear anymore as in the earlier days. So almost like this is not even, it's not important, it's a Bible. So that would favor what you're suggesting, that there is this idea of just being representative or prestige. Whether there is also the intention of showing, well, we are better than you or not, that I cannot say, but I think I would not exclude it. It's just that I haven't looked into the history of these individual codices, and there may be something in there. But clearly decoration and other features became more important in certain contexts, which are, of course, the ones, if a holding institution has it nowadays, is the one that you can show broadly and be very happy, of course. I mean, brilliant illustrations and pictures and everything. Thank you.
Altre domande? Altrimenti?
Do you have other questions? If not, we can proceed with a discussion on the lecture by Professor Schmeckel. We already have one question, so I invite you to repeat.
Thank you, and apologies for the confusion before. My question on the matter of justice, you talked about how the biblical text supported the duties of kings to act as judges and keepers of peace. But I'd like to know if or how the Bible was used for other public figures at the same periods, such as lay aristocrats like counts or dukes, or even ecclesiastical ones like bishops and abbots. Is there any difference on the way in which the Bible was used to justify their actions as judges in relation to the royalty, or was used kind of in the same way?
Thank you very much. A very interesting question. I must remind you that I'm a poor legal historian who is interested in legal texts, not exclusively, but mainly. So I have had a look on those texts which are important for the legal tradition in these various kingdoms. And as I'm a canonist as well, I have had a look on the ecclesiastical text. And to some extent, I had some knowledge on the historiography and the, for example, the Mirror of the Princes literature in the Frankish Empire. So I have only had some glimpses at literature beyond the legal historical context, and I know I'm not simply capable of stating on the medieval or the literature on the centuries after the Roman Empire in their completeness. I think what I see in those texts which I mentioned, that especially if you see the direct equivalent of the prince and the judge, that it is more about the office. And if you have this office of rendering justice, it has no real distinguishing effect if you are a prince or a count or a baron. It is the same office, and you must fulfill what has been demanded by God from this office. So in order to attempt a preliminary answer to your question, I would say it is of no greater importance as far as I can see.
Other remarks, questions? Pietro Fusco, Strasbourg University.
Thank you for the presentation. During during which I was thinking about it is just a curiosity. I was thinking about the model that has been well established by Foucault of the confessor and judge, the one that figure that lets the powerful and other citizen to confess what is private but also public, and create a kind of ambiguous dimension in the medieval world. I don't know if you got the ref of l'histoire de la sexualité, surveiller, punir.
You asked me about the difference between this public and a private sphere concerning the
I was just
penitentials.
yes, I was just asking if this model has been applied in this field of late antiquity studies, especially during the formation of Visigoths, for instance, and the 5th century kingdoms. If you have something to share.
Well, I'm not really that informed on confessional practice in the Visigothic realm. What I know is about the Irish tradition, and here you must be aware that the monks held most of the power in the country. Less, the kings had much less influence compared to the continent, because to some extent the monasteries were the great landowners, and the difference of the kingdoms and the lesser role of the bishops and the cities made the monks much more important as the principal owner of the public power in Ireland than in much other countries, except of course Brittany and Wales. And so this is all one culture. So that I think it is quite difficult to talk about the difference of public and private when the power is established on the guidance of souls by the monks. So it is the most intimate, the most private, which is taken here as the foundation for the public power of the monks. So the system worked quite differently, certainly to our times, but also to some extent to the other realms. And I think we have to think here from the office of the monks to serve the country, to establish justice, which needs also the most intimate to be revealed. And this is only going to be a necessity or a requirement in order to establish justice in the country. So I think we have to be aware that the most intimate elements might become official in order to fulfill the duties of all those who act in the field of jurisdiction.
Claudia.
Grazie. Sono Claudia Storti.
Thank you, Claudia Storti. I will speak Italian because I know you speak Italian very well. So my question is a question as a law historian. So I like to know these differences, especially among the most ancient texts of the Germanic populations, and so the Edict of Theodoric, and then Visigoth's laws, etc. Well, you showed different influence from the text, the fundamental principles of truth and justice on this text. So, what could be the origin of this difference? Maybe as the age, the times when they were written, or the places where they were written, or the dissemination of the biblical text in the different regions, and the knowledge, as you said. So the fact that there was a Bible didn't doesn't mean that they were reading it, but maybe there was also a political use of religious texts. I don't know. Maybe you can tell me. Yes, you are right. There is a strict connection between government and justice, how justice was used to establish and justify the power of king or counts, etc. And of course, in a government like the government of Clovis, who didn't have the courage to present himself as the coder, creator of a code, of a codex. It doesn't have the courage to present a system of revenge from a criminal point of view that he presents as the latest revenge of God's anger. He knew torture very well, but this is not how he presented himself. So the power of the king was not enough in a time of Clovis. And this explains also the change of the ruling of Visigoth kings, because at the beginning there is an important position and role of the king as the first representative of the government, of the political power, and this position this position loses some influence and the church becomes more important. In this movement, the justification of the church combines with the public power. The king becomes more and more dependent on the church until the time when the crown is requested by the concilium, by the bishops. And so this is a very important connection, and it is also a way to explain the public power of each one of these peoples and kings. In your written text, will you also talk about the influence on Lombards? Yes, yes, of course. I had to skip half of my text because I didn't have time to talk about it, but I will talk about the Longobards law. I have a question for you. The lecture was really fascinating on the connection between truth and justice, the role of Christianity, so justice and purity. What I like to ask my friend Professor Schmaker is the following question. My impression is that in the different kingdoms, Visigoth, Carolingian, Frank, Frankish, and Longobards, but also England, there is almost at the same time a strengthening of the intervention of the king on the justice, which is often quoted by Pepin and Liutprand almost in the same years. So the impression, but on this, I'd like your confirmation or not, is that the substantial motivation is political. I mean, these are similar ways, even if different ways in the four contexts. I try to show this to show the primacy of the king on justice and power, which is more or less the same thing. If we use the king as a last resort, this means to make justice, to try and make justice, and also to strengthen the role of the king on the local rulers. So, in this context, the Christian role, well, my impression is that it doesn't consider the biblical text, which we don't see. The first one who uses biblical text was probably Charlemagne in the Novits of 779, and this become legal text. The others um, perform the exercise of justice, and justice as an ethical and religious value, or the recall of bishops as Justinian started because he made it possible to recall the bishop against the secular ruling, and this happens in Visigoths. On the contrary, Longobards have a clear separation between church and power. Liutprand adopted um, the contents not directly from the biblical text, but always through the influence of the church as an institution. So I'd like to know whether you consider my observation and impressions reasonable. Well, what can I say? There is a problem if I don't find direct sources, especially in the communication, the use of the Bible. This does not mean that it was not there. And of course, well, I'm not sure that they read the Bible. But what did they know? What did they know at the time? They had discussions. They have other texts that at the moment I don't know. I mean, I cannot give you an answer. I must consider connections which go beyond what we are discussing today. What you said, especially on the distinction between Visigoths and Longobards, well, this is obvious if we go back to Claudia's question. This was the explanation of the weakness of Visigoth kings during the 7th and 8th century when the church becomes uh, the, the great power. So this does not happen in Lombardy, and maybe this is the main difference between the two kingdoms. Excuse me, I just would like to say something. It's clear that the Christian element in the different laws is different. The percentage of the Christian law is different. It's very different, also depending on the legislative um, on the legislation and the legislative system of the kingdom. I am very struck by the strong difference of the Visigoth laws compared to the other laws. Because what we see in the Visigothic laws is the extreme anti Jewish attitude, which is a unicum. It's a bit difficult to think of a biblical declination of such an attitude. I mean, it might be possible, but this aspect has been highlighted very well in different pages by Bernard Birmingham's book. But it is an attitude. I mean, what do you think? It is an attitude of the absolutistic will of the Visigothic kings, which is incredible, as already highlighted. And this is a difference with the Christian religion. In the Visigothic laws, there is the concept that we can call racist. I mean, it is not so. Those who are born from Jewish religion are Jews. So this is racism. So where does it come from? So this is to say that every law is different from the other, and Visigoths are absolutely peculiar. They're not the only ones. Also, the Visigothic laws are important and very strict against slavery. They're stricter than other laws. So maybe they are part of this absolutism of the Visigothic kings. So I apologize for my remarks. Um, it's I'm a bit confused at the moment. Thank you for your question during my presentation. I was afraid that it will be too redundant. The words of justice and verity, which were repeated several times. But however, this phenomenon that I wanted to highlight, and the idea that the jurisdiction might establish the central order, could be used both by a king or a bishop, and so the change, the differences are not among these ideas, news in the religious field, but the use of these ideas is different in the different kingdoms. But I have a question. Was there an influence of the church? Well, we should find an answer to this question. So we talk about justice and verity, and this is what I found, what I studied.
Sì, la professora Cristiani.
Professor Cristiani is asking me to read her question because she has a vocal issue. She has, so I will read her question. We can read together. Do you believe that justice refers to the law which is not necessarily Christian law? In year 858, first Germanic invasion of France recalls bishops to judge loyalty to the king and stops the invasion. A European date. Well, the text that I know underlines the importance of following the Roman power. This is a text by Ink, Marso Roman or Burgundian or Salic. I mean, it doesn't matter. The only tradition, important law tradition, is that of the Apostolic Church. And it says that its understanding of the ecclesiastic condition was mostly the Pope's tradition. And so he explains a change in the use of law, which is almost a revolution. So also for us, the Frankish people, the Frankish law is no more valid. We have to follow the Pope's law. And of course, this is an influence for all Europe. So Europe was becoming unified and was becoming a Christian field, but I don't see it gives importance to the king, even though he was chancellor. Do we have another question? Yes, Antonella Briand, a teacher of high school. So we teach our students that in Middle Age, the guide of the kings was the Tede di Agostino, as Agustin today. So when we talk about the influence of the Bible also in medieval legislation, do we mean the Bible or do we mean the influence of the law through Augustine? Oh my God, what a question! A difficult question. Well, as Pilatus was saying, what is the truth? What is the Bible? We can say, what is the Bible? I'm afraid I cannot give a clear answer to this question. There are several varieties of the biblical tradition, so I believe it is um, really difficult to give an explanation. Well, something we know is that there was a broad knowledge of St. Augustine's tradition, but I don't want to make a difference between his tradition and the tradition of the Bible. Apologies if I intervene. I still have some blood sugar in my blood. So, as everybody knows, in St. Augustine, the main political concept is the idea of justice, on which Augustine wrote wonderful pages. And he used the very famous anecdote, which is the anecdote of Alexander the pirate. I will be brief. So this is a very famous anecdote, and it says the kingdoms without justice are not kingdoms. So Alexander says, aren't you ashamed of taking things that don't belong to you? Um, so you are doing it with a great fleet, and you call yourself emperor. I do it with a small ship, and I'm called a pirate. So this is an anecdote which is very dear to Augustine, and it comes from a pagan author, Cicero, and it is Cicero's text. we do not, um, we know it through Augustine, but for sure it is a text by Cicero. So this means that there are some overlaps of the pagan culture at certain level and a Christian culture. There isn't always a separation, so they are not always like two armies, one against the other. May I add something else? With Professor Flash demonstrated, there is an important difference between the works in the works of Saint Augustine, and so a deep change. Uh, there isn't a single tradition of Saint Augustine, but there is a great variety and different positions, and this makes it more difficult to give a single answer to this very interesting question. But one thing is sure, St. Augustine is a very important authority until the 10th, 11th century. For example, there is a text on penitence, which is very important at the end of the 10th century. 10th century. I don't know whether there are other questions. I don't want to stop the discussion, but we have already discussed for 1 hour, and then we will have a very intense afternoon. So I will just recall you that the afternoon session is going to start at 3:30 with a lecture by Professor Luschiavo, and then we will go on until late tonight. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.